How's it going, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Artisans of Steel podcast. This is a first episode where I have a very talented, incredible artist of steel in here with me that actually hasn't been featured in the calendar yet, but whose work definitely merits conversation. And so we're going to get to Vince in just a moment here. First, I want to talk about the Patreon super sponsors. If you want to join the Patreon, you can go to patreon.com and look up Mal Mossy Fire Arts. Also on my Instagram page, I have a link that goes to a link tree that goes straight, has a link to the Patreon as well. If you join at the illuminated individual level or higher, you get to become part of these conversations and talk to these esteemed makers and talented artists and ask questions directly of them, being part of the conversation and seeing these conversations live as they're happening. Oftentimes we have some live conversations with the chat on the side while we're doing these interviews. But with that said, I'm going to move forward with the super sponsors this month. First off, we have Lawrence Lake of Maritime Knife Supply. He's on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at maritimenifesupply.com, or let me back that Maritime Knife Supply. But you can also find him on the web at www.maritimenifesupply.com. He's a great source for all kinds of basically anything a knife maker needs. And if he doesn't already carry it, he can look at sourcing it and getting it for you. He is based out of Atlantic, Canada, but he is a great resource for American makers and a supplier for American makers as well. So again, go check him out, maritimenifesupply.com. Next, we have Gabe Fletcher of Anchorage Brewing. He's also, his maker page is Anchorage Forge. He is a newer maker, but he is already rock and rolling, doing some really solid work. Anchorage, the brewing side of things, he is an award-winning brewer and has made some of the best beers I've ever tasted in my life. I'm actually going to be up later this month doing some collaboration work with him, which I'm very excited about. But go check out his Instagram, give him a follow. He's doing, again, really great work. Especially on his Damascus, he's getting astonishing high contrast finishes. Definitely worth a follow. Next up, we have Eric Kidwell. He is at District 202 LLC. He is a creative maker person of sorts who has been part of the knife making community for a long time. Vince, who also knows Eric, knows that at the Travis Works Hammer, and Eric is the guy who's always there to help and support. He's running the camera so that everybody has a secondary close-up view of what's going on during the demonstrations. He's an awesome guy. He's based out of Maryland. Go give him a follow at District 202 LLC. Next, we have Josh Weston. He is on Instagram at Josh A. Weston, as well as part of the at Dragon Forge EXP. That's the Dragon Forge experience. They are a group of fabricated forges that look like dragons that cruise around to various Renaissance festivals around the country, and they are meticulously made. They're pretty cool, and they create a very fun experience, I think, for people who have never hit hot steel before, and then to do it out of the mouth of a fire-breathing dragon is very kind of creative and magical and fun. Josh on his own is a very talented graphics art designer and maker. He's actually working on a German ring sword, or a Germanic ring sword. I know very little, but I know that they, I think it is the Celtic Germans that were swinging those things around, but maybe Vince can enlighten me. He is much better versed in some of the historical aspects of some of those Germanic swords and knives. So go check him out, Josh A. Weston. And I'm also excited to see him actually next month at the Blade Show. He's going to be there. I think he's going to be running around doing his at show build. So if you catch him, you see him, go say hi to him. See what he's working on. He's always having a good time running around there. All right, next up we have Russell Tinsley of Ouzel Finch Beers. His maker page is Can't Make Knives, so that's not true anymore. He's taken some classes. He's been learning himself up. He's doing some good work. But he's also a brewer, and he owns Ouzel Finch Beers in Virginia, as well as Nos Brewing Project. So both of them are really incredibly and delicious beers. And if you go to the local beer market and if they're not already carrying it, tell them to get it. But if they got it, make sure you get some, because the beers are really, really interesting. I think they call them like soda beer. Some of them are like soda beers, and some of them are like beer smoothies in a way, which sounds really weird, but it totally works. But they also specialize in sours that are incredibly delicious. Either way, go get some Ouzel Finch beer wherever you can, and check out his maker page, Can't Make Knives, on Instagram, where he is doing his knife thing. And then finally, we have Dan Hubbs, who is at 66 Mountain Knives on Instagram and Facebook. Excuse me. He is a talented maker as well. I had the fortune of working with fortunate. I can't think of the word. I've had the fortune of working with him. He came to my class last September, where we talked all things Damascus and pattern welding and pattern design and all kinds of stuff. And he's really taken that ball and ran with it. He's doing some awesome work and very solid work. He also makes his own copper Damascus. But go check him out on Instagram. His stuff is worth having a look at and giving a follow, because he does some very exemplary finishing work, especially on his blades. But he makes really great hunters and EDCs. Again, go check him out on Instagram at 66. Those are the numbers, 66 Mountain Knives. All right, finally, we are going to get into our conversation today. Vince Evans is a very incredible maker whose work is world-renowned and featured in, I think, several museums. I've admired your work, Vince, for a very long time. And especially as I've started to dive into some historical patterns around Roman spathas, and just seeing the level of execution that you accomplish in your work is pretty stunning. And we have some great examples that you've sent through emails, and we'll have a look at probably later. But thank you for joining me for this conversation, joining us for this conversation, to kind of get to know you better. I know you peripherally from shows, as well as doing the Travis Wirtz hammering. But I don't know you super well. So this is a great, really like authentic opportunity for me to try to get to know you better and your story, and to share that with everybody else. So welcome, sir.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me. I like to hide in my corner of the world and just do my thing and not be known by anybody. It's more fun that way.
Top secret. You kind of sneak out of nowhere, and people are shocked, and I'm sure, and blown away when they see your work.
Yeah, that's kind of how it was when I did my first blade show.
Well, and how long ago was that?
Ooh, I want to say around 95, 96, 97, somewhere in that range. I just kind of decided it was time to go, and I went. And I happened to be walking around, not at the table, and Grace said, "Oh, the Master Smiths, like the Arkansas Mafia," walked up and said, "Who's this?" So
nice.
That was fun, because I had like maybe 5 or 6 swords on the table, all pattern welded, and nobody ever heard of me.
Right.
So
let's back up. And what's your background? How did you get to where you're at now? Where did you grow up, and what was early life like?
Born a poor white boy on the streets of Honolulu, Hawaii.
Okay.
Literally born poor white boy. My parents are both artists full time.
Okay.
My dad went there as a structural engineer, worked for a dredging company, and then about 65 he decided he was going to become a full-time blacksmith.
Oh, interesting.
Gave up the good paying job to become a blacksmith. And so I pretty much grew up in an artist family, which meant in Hawaii especially no money. But I was creative. My dad was creative. My mom was a portrait artist, and I just kind of grew up around the forge. My earliest memories, cranking the blower for him, because he had an old, I guess back then it was like a sheet metal, an old Champion forge, and he had a crank blower on it. And so, when you're like 5 years old, cranking a blower at a coal forge is a lot of fun. So.
Yeah, I actually have a picture of that you shared. I'll pull up. Let's see. Share that real quick.
That was when I was in 2nd grade. That was it was a thing called a fantasy fair. This is what, 1970, I think.
Okay.
So you're talking like, height of the hippie era in Hawaii. So there was this
Okay.
kind of a craft fair slash Renaissance slash let it all hang out fair
Yeah.
out at a dairy farm on the North Shore. And so my dad set up this blacksmith shop, and my mom was there with her doing her paintings and portraits, and us kids were just kind of running around. And that's kind of what I remember growing up. My dad he learned blacksmithing, I think when he was in college back in Tennessee.
Yeah.
And so he just kind of went with it. And he actually is pretty good considering, I mean, way better than me as a blacksmith. I'm useless at ornamental ironwork.
Okay.
I can make a nail. I can maybe make a hook. That's about it.
I got you. I feel the same way when people ask, like, you smith all the time, don't you? I'm like, kind of. I make blades.
Yeah,
That is
I make
very,
blades.
very small portion of the whole spectrum of blacksmithing.
Yeah, and that's just it. My dad, he couldn't shoe horses, but he was actually really good and more or less self-taught in ornamental. Oh, wow. And then same thing with his metal. Did a lot of repoussé, hammered copper.
Okay.
And so he did a lot of sculpture work that was basically hollow, kind of like how the Statue of Liberty is. Okay. Hollow copper, but he did individual muscles, soldered them all together, created figures and all that. So I grew up around metalwork, handcrafting.
Yeah.
And I like more the fantasy, Lord of the Rings, swords and battles and that sort of stuff. So I leaned in that direction.
I got you. I must have been really I guess formative for that to be what day-to-day life was creative endeavors. But also to see, like with your mom with her portrait work, to just see a complete image come out of nowhere, except for from her hand with whatever utensils.
Oh yeah, because I would go to school with a blank canvas sitting on an easel, and you come home and there's like a picture of somebody. She did a lot of Hawaiian royalty.
Oh wow.
And so she had portraits in hotels, probably in museums. I'm not sure.
Oh wow.
I knew the portraits, and I never knew a lot of times where they ended up, but I remember seeing some of them in lobbies of hotels. And that's so cool. Like I mean, I would actually, even as a kid, sometimes have to like provide a hand.
Oh yeah.
A hand for her to look at while she was painting something. She's like, "Can you stand here and put your hand like this?" And then she would sit there and just to get the details, like, is the finger the right way, It's like,
right. Oh, I got you.
So, like I said, growing up, all of that was just a part of who I was, just seeing art, from start to finish.
Well, and also all the metal work. And I think the thing that really captures people's minds is that steel is seen as this strong and hard and immovable thing, but once you heat it up, it turns kind of into putty in a way. And so you watch somebody transform what is just like a chunk of steel or maybe one type of thing, like even just like a leaf spring or a coil or something like that, and then completely transform it into another shape or into a scroll. I think that's part of the magic that people experience when they see that, because you're transforming this kind of immovable object but you're using very crude tools in a way. It's just like a chunk of steel as an anvil and a hammer. And I think it's pretty amazing. I think if I were a kid watching that growing up, I would have just been mesmerized by it nonstop.
Yeah, like you say, it's like it doesn't take a lot. The tools haven't really changed for millennia.
Yeah.
Hammers, anvils, maybe they're more refined than they were, but really not that much. You could use a rock as an anvil if that's what you had.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and that's probably what early early even hammers and anvils were, right? When people
I would imagine, I would think, even coppersmithing, really, a smooth river rock and another smooth river rock to hammer on, you could actually do a lot of work with copper or bronze.
Sure. I would be, because I know that the Northwest Native American, and a lot of Native peoples around the world have done work with, especially with non-ferrous metals, but even with iron. But what that was like for them to see what that would have looked like, a few hundred years ago or 1,000 years ago when they were doing that work.
Well, the positions, smiths like, Wayland and, the Norse, hero smith, so to speak, they were all held in mystique and high honor because of their ability to form, like you say, raw iron or bronze or whatever metal into something functional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Pretty incredible. What, so growing up in that kind of family, what was, you must have found, because you are obviously a very creative and talented person. Is that something that also came somewhat naturally to you, or is that something you developed over time from those early influences of your parents? And how does that transform into the sword making that you're doing
Yeah,
now?
I got straight A's in art class from 7th grade. So 6 years of straight A's. That's the only thing that kept my GPA at all up. I wasn't good at anything else, but I could do
Right.
art. So I guess it was inbred in me. My brother and sister both have talent in their own ways, but
Okay.
none of them pursue it the way I
Okay.
do. My
Yeah.
parents didn't encourage or discourage us. It's just kind of let us go. And this is the direction that I felt called. Basically, I got out of high school with like no direction. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I did not want to go back to school because I endured,
Sure.
school. So if I couldn't study art because that meant going to a university and taking math and things like that just to get an art degree. So I just kind of started working in the garage. My mom had a dollhouse and I thought, hey, I could probably make some kitchen knives for it. And then I started forging music wire into swords. These are all 1/12 scale.
Right.
To
Wow.
fit the proportions of a dollhouse. And then she had friends that said, can you make me some swords for my dollhouse? And next thing I know, I'm doing craft fairs selling miniature swords, fully tempered and sharp.
Oh, wow.
This is in like 1980, 81.
And what's the piano wire made out of that would have made it
I
suitable?
don't know. I would guess it's probably just like 1095 or something. It's a
Okay.
high carbon. You can still buy it. In fact, I just bought some at Ace the other day because I use it for
Oh, sure.
takedown when I do certain types of basket
Oh,
hilts.
yeah.
I use music wire for the takedown pin. It's about 4 inches long, and my pommel nut has a hole through it, like a
Yeah.
lot of old Scottish military swords did.
Okay.
And so I use a tempered steel 1/8 inch rod or 3/32 that just
Right.
goes along with the sword, so you can slip it in. It's not going to bend. It comes pre-tempered. You can, like I said, you can get it. It's a hobby wire, but they call it piano wire because I assume that's what's used in pianos to make the music.
Sure. And I've seen those, and I actually have some. They're usually like in 10 or
It
12
it'll
inch sections.
I ones I buy are in 3 foot lengths.
Oh, wow. Okay.
You can buy them. I believe they also make it in like a pack of. Basically, they take 3 feet and they chop it into 1 foot sections so they
Sure.
can put it in a blister pack. But
Sure.
I actually just bought 1/8 inch and 3/32 the other day because I was having a hard time finding 3/32 at the one Ace, and another one in town had it, so I bought enough to supply me for a while.
Yeah. Okay. So
But
you're
it's
oh,
pre-tempered. Like I said, I would take it and forge it into sword blades and then retemper it. So I learned a
mhm.
lot of heat treating, working with a piece that long, how to
Right.
make it retemper it so it's springy again.
Right.
So all
Wow.
my trial and error was done on like 3 inches or less.
Tiny little swords.
They're out
Well,
there
I can imagine.
somewhere.
Yeah, I believe it.
I sold
Well,
quite a few back in the day, so there's a lot of them out there somewhere.
that's so wild.
And that
So,
was 1983. I started doing some full size knives because I signed up for a Renaissance fair, and it's like I needed
okay.
something bigger than a miniature sword because people wanted to stick things on their belts.
Yeah. Okay. So
So
that was going to be kind of my next question. Like, so you start as a little kid, or a
mhm,
kid selling these miniature swords
pretty
made
much,
out of
yeah, straight
piano
out of
wire.
high school. So
Yeah. And then yeah, so then the next step is to start doing real size knives and swords.
yeah,
And
83. I started,
yeah.
like I said, I needed some form of inventory for this. It was a Renaissance fair in Hawaii. It was 3 weekends through the summer.
Okay. That
So
was on a
yeah, I was on Oahu. It was took place at a college campus. So it was a perfect setting. It rained, so it was muddy and straw everywhere. They put straw down so you could walk through the straw and not get your feet so muddy.
oh, sure.
So it really added to that disgusting medieval atmosphere of
Yeah,
everybody
right.
covered in mud and sweat and everything. But it felt like a medieval village and it was fun.
That's interesting. Is that a festival that they still have going on there?
No, they did it in 82 and 83. I went in 82 just as a spectator because I was curious. And then I
Sure.
signed up for 83. And then it didn't happen again until I want to say 87. They did one down in Waikiki at the Waikiki Shell, which is totally out of context. It didn't have anywhere near that same kind of feel.
Sure.
But I think it was so expensive to do. And it was
Yeah.
kind of an out of the way place. They had a good turnout. I mean, I thought there were quite a few people at this fair, but it was just expensive. And it was a production company that did puppet shows and all that. When I was a kid, I remember them
Yeah.
coming to schools doing puppet shows. And the guy that ran it played Santa Claus at the major shopping center on Christmas time.
I
And
got
so
you.
they were the ones that kind of sponsored it. And they had that old world feel too. You know, the family they were basically entertainers. They did, like I say, puppet shows and things like that on the side. So they were the ones that put on that craft fair or that Ren fair, and it just became too expensive.
Yeah.
But
I
that
got
got me going because then I linked up with the SCA, and you know, for what it's worth, they're good for a fledgling knife maker
Sure.
to be able to do daggers and things like that and get the experience. You know,
Yeah, and for people who aren't familiar with the Society of Creative Anachronism, can you explain what that is?
it's a bunch of very poor college kids who want really nice stuff, and they want to pay you $20 a month for it. So.
I
It's a
got you.
group of a lot of it is college kids. They get into reenacting medieval battles using rattan swords and real armor because a rattan sword
Mhm.
will break your bones if you don't wear armor.
Oh, wow.
And they get into the whole aspects of medieval, the calligraphy, the brewing of mead, all sorts of different things, and it's an interesting group.
Mm,
Like I said, they all want real swords or real knives to carry on their belts.
Yeah,
And so it's a good way as a young knife maker to kind of get into if you're into period pieces anyway,
sure.
to get into the market. They don't have a lot of money, or at least they didn't back when I was doing it.
Yeah.
But it was a good way for me to get involved in doing something, and it allowed me to dress up too if I wanted to,
Yeah.
because
So, oh, go ahead.
living that fantasy life is half the fun.
Absolutely.
Not wanting to face reality of the world.
Right. What was your SCA name? Did you have one?
Yeah, Andal McClellan.
Undamit?
McClellan was one of my mom's,
Oh, okay.
not her maiden name, but her grandmother's maiden name. So
Yeah,
that fits part of the Scottish link. And
I got you. So when I first learned about the SCA, I was like, so is it just like LARPing? And my buddy who over at Jamie Lundell over at
okay, yeah.
Dragon's Breath Forge, he's like, well, it's a little bit more than just the people fighting around playing,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
there's so much more. There's more interest in the actual history and historical
Hmm.
accuracy and all that kind of stuff, which I thought was actually very interesting. So, and I can't remember like the range of period people are like it's usually happening
It
within.
it usually would go from, they would consider like from the Viking age into like about 1600, I
Okay,
believe, typically.
okay,
Because you usually didn't see, I'm trying to remember if they didn't allow anything earlier than Viking age,
okay.
and nothing to the point of like a firearm more than a matchlock was, I
I
think, the
got you.
general guidelines I recall.
So when you say Viking age, is that like migration period, or is
No,
that
that
like
would be like
1000?
about, I would say 10th century, so
Okay,
900 on, yeah,
I got
is
you.
what I would consider the time frame they accept. Not that they wouldn't, there's no reason they couldn't have done late migration,
Yeah,
as far as, really, they still call them Vikings, even though they weren't yet. But,
sure.
because that runs from about 500 to about what, 850 roughly, when they were suddenly called Vikings instead.
Yeah. There's so much. I I feel like I would love to sit and hear you talk about European history, especially around Vikings and Romans and Celts, because there's just such an incredible breadth of information that I still have a very small grasp on.
I, I only know the parts connected to the swords.
I see.
When we go
Okay.
to work on a specific project and they're like, okay, who are these people? I better find out who they were. Like, who are the Merovingians? It's like, okay, I
Sure.
better go and find out
Well,
who they were.
yeah, well, I think that's really cool because you're not just looking at historical pieces and then trying to replicate them. It sounds like you're trying to get a deeper context, kind of along the lines of
Mhm.
the SCA context as to what did the world look like and who are these people that would have been holding and carrying these swords.
Right, and that's a lot of it is, I guess it helps you because I like to get into the mood when I'm
Sure.
working on a specific piece, and if you know my work, you know that I don't do just Viking or just Scottish.
Right.
I've even done a few Japanese pieces way back, but I pretty much cover the spectrum. I do Ottoman Turkish, I do pre-Ottoman Turkish, I do Chinese, I do
Hmm.
Persian, you name it, I've done it pretty much. Indonesian.
Yeah. Well, and I would imagine because now that I have that better kind of concept of how you approach the making, at least conceptualizing and design, it seems like at first it would seem like, oh, I want to make this style of sword just because it's cool. But I'm sure it's probably when you're looking around, you see or you hear or you read legends or read stories about
Hmm.
different weapons and stuff, and then or different people, and then you're like, well, what was what kind of stuff was that person carrying around? So
Hmm.
there's got to be actually a lot of different things that I guess grab your attention or your interest for you to then start moving in the direction of trying to recreate a thing rather than it just being like a cool pattern of a blade or something like that.
Yeah, a lot of times it might start even like you say with the culture rather than the piece. When I was a
Sure.
kid, my dad loved classical music, and he had an album, I believe it was called The Ring Without Words. It was Wagner's Ring of the Nibelungen,
Mm.
but it was instrumental only.
Oh,
And
cool.
on the album cover was Sigurd slaying the dragon. So this is like
Oh,
this,
sure.
naked guy with a sword entwined with this serpent kind of thing. But that the artwork of it was so intriguing to me. Just this, this battle of this raw
Right.
primal battle between a warrior and a serpent that kind of fueled that whole concept of these ancient warriors. And then of course Lord of the Rings back in like high school and all that was really
Right.
back before it was popular, before there were movies, there was a book.
Yeah. There was a book.
And everybody had their concepts of what things look like. The Hildebrandt brothers, I had a calendar of theirs, and to me that was what Lord of the Rings characters look like more so than what was in the movie.
All right, that's a good point. There was a lot of it was up to interpretation. Various artists would have
Yeah,
their own take.
right. You had,
Yeah.
the like Alan Lee, the guys that did their stuff, and I had some of his, but to me, I like the Hildebrandt brothers' work. It just looked more classic, and it was on some of the earlier covers of the Lord of the Rings from probably the late '70s into the '80s era.
Mm.
And now, if you don't do it according to the movies, everybody thinks it's wrong. It's like, no, no, no. There were books and there was art long before the movies came out.
Probably, yeah, tons of
But
artwork.
those sorts of things as a kid, those sort images fuel what you do. And in high school, I did a lot of pen and ink drawing,
Oh,
just
cool. Yeah,
because I didn't know what else to do with my life. So,
sure.
my spare time, I would just do pen and ink drawings, and most of it was kind of Lord of the Rings based. Warriors and things like that, orcs and people chopping each other up and things like that, just for the fun of it.
Right. when so out of high school, well, wait. So during high school, were you working any kind of jobs?
No, kids didn't work in high school
Okay.
unless you were smart enough to go get a job at McDonald's or something. No, there wasn't a whole lot.
Okay.
Back then, really, high school kids, you could only do things like maybe inventory for a few days
Right.
at a department store, that sort of thing. Hawaii was very laid back,
Yeah.
and there wasn't a lot other than like working at the pineapple cannery.
Oh,
Most
sure.
school age kids didn't work, and that was just seasonal. And
Right.
so no, I never did any of that. So I just, my dad would have me come down to the shop.
I
Not
gotcha.
as often as I would have liked. In retrospect, I look back and I realize it would have been great if I had spent more time in the shop. My brother, in the early days of my dad forging, my brother worked with him a lot because my dad had a contract for a restaurant and he made like a ton of Viking spears. I have no clue what they were for, but
Viking
he made
spears.
a Viking spears, yeah. And so my dad had actually made a swage block. They had
Oh, yeah.
the V for the rib and the blade, and my brother helped him build all those.
Oh, wow.
I've got that swage block, but I never
Oh,
saw the
cool.
Viking spears other than maybe a little bit when I was very young working.
Right.
And so my dad, he couldn't afford to pay me, so I think he didn't want me. He didn't want me to just say, "Hey, can you come and help me in the shop?" If he couldn't afford to pay me,
I
to
see.
him it didn't seem right. But I'm like, man, it would have been great if I could have spent a lot more time, in the shop.
Right. Yeah. I I wish I had. don't know. When I was a kid, I was also a poor white kid. Although now, as I've gotten older, I realize I'm not just a white kid. I'm also like I'm half Samoan
Right,
and
yeah.
part Chinese. So,
I was
but I
actually a minority.
yeah yeah. And but where I grew up, I didn't see a lot of people of color, so I always just
Mhm,
automatically identified as white kid.
right.
Um, and so, but yeah, just working at McDonald's and crap like that, just working
Mhm,
those dumb jobs, um, was a major part of me being able to help support the family while I wanted to learn how to drive. So, but we couldn't
mhm,
afford like the extra cost of the insurance to be able to
right.
have me driving. So, yeah, I've been working since I was like 14, 15.
Wow. I
Um,
actually had a real job for 6 months,
nice.
straight
Proud of
out of high school, yeah, and I
well,
realized
that
this
was gonna
isn't
be my
fun.
yeah, it's gonna be so when you were doing the mini swords and stuff, that was gonna be my next. What other kind of work were you doing at the same time, or have you always just kind of been full on swords and
Um,
knives?
well, I started making the swords and knives out of high school, so, like, that summer,
Yeah,
that summer I started making the stuff for my mom's dollhouse because I was totally bored.
right.
And then about 6 months, I remember at the end of the year, I got a job making suntan lotion.
For
Did
like banana boat,
commercially. No, it
or
was a
Hawaiian
company called
tropic.
Royal Hawaiian Paba Corporation. They were using
Okay,
para-aminobenzoic acid, which was a crystalline thing that would form like a fern pattern when it dried, and it was supposed to block the sun.
hmm.
It's probably toxic now, but back then it wasn't.
Right.
So, yeah, so
You're
six
still
months I did
alive.
that. I'm still alive. Yeah, I mean I was making it in like, oh geez, we would drain like 4 55-gallon drums of pineapple alcohol, which is,
Pineapple alcohol.
well, it was alcohol basically. It was made of
Yeah.
the pineapple. It was a byproduct of the pineapple factory.
Oh,
And
okay.
so it was denatured because the hospitals would buy it, and they would buy
Right.
it in 55-gallon drums. And so it had like, I don't know, 5% acetone or something. So you couldn't drink it, but it smelled like pineapple juice. And
Sure.
so that's what we use. And we drained those into this huge tank and add all the other ingredients. So for 6 months, I did that. And I was on the side making my miniature swords. And I realized after 6 months, it's like, I really don't like working for somebody else.
Okay.
So I decided, like my dad, to quit the good job that actually paid me, I think, $5 an hour, which was good money back then.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then that was in 1981. Yeah. And
Okay.
then quit that summer. I went to California for 2 weeks with my aunt and uncle, which is like the first time I'd ever left Hawaii,
Sure.
which is for Hawaii fairly common for kids. I mean, if you left one of the islands and went to another island, you were fortunate. I never got on a plane till I was in 10th grade.
Sure. Yeah.
To go to the other side of the island was a 1 hour drive, and that was like going to the far side of the moon.
I know. It's so
So
fun.
went to California, came back, and a room, I guess. My dad had a shop in what had been an old iron foundry, and they had
Okay.
turned it into an art community.
Oh, interesting.
And so one of the little stalls, which had been the grinding room of the foundry, my dad's shop was in the sandblasting room.
Okay.
And they had at one time had a big pedestal grinder in the little side room that I was in, and so I rented that. So July 1st, I think, really, of 1981, I went officially full time with a public shop.
Nice.
Basically out of high school, no clue what direction I was going in, other than I knew how to make miniature swords, and that's where I was going to go with it. And it was
Okay.
literally right next to my dad's shop. We shared the same forge and everything. So
Right.
that was really when I started seeing him working on metal, 6 days a week.
Okay.
And that's really when I picked up more of the whole copper bronze work
Right.
abilities to, hammer sheet metal. Everybody talks about, the fittings for my scabbard, just like, oh, I'd rather do this or this. And I'm like, I got so used to doing it, I can do it in my sleep, hammering out, you
Sure.
know, sheet metal fittings and all that.
Right.
And
That's,
now during that time,
mhm.
there were a few collectors of antique knives and swords that had been coming to my dad, and this is in the early 80s, and asking him to fix things. They would buy like a
Oh.
Chinese, like what is it? I think it's called a guandao, like that big
Oh
glaive
yeah.
on a stick, and it would be
Right.
missing the brass collar. So they would have him do that, and he didn't have enough time to deal with that. So he's like, my son likes this kind of stuff. Why don't you let him do it? So I
That's what
started
an apprentice is for, right?
basically, yeah. So I
Yeah.
started doing restoration work on antique pieces.
I got you.
And so that's kind of how I got a feel for that stuff. My friend would bring in like a yatagan in pieces and say, can
Oh,
you make all
cool.
the parts that are missing, put it all back together?
Yeah.
And so I kind of figured out how old stuff came apart and went together, what
Yeah.
the scabbard should look like, what the scabbard should feel like, things like that. And so that kind of helped guide the direction I went in.
I got you. Yeah. Uh, First time I ever saw Yatagan, I was like, there was just something about the long, gentle, sweeping kind of
Hmm.
curve that just, it's so subtle. They're absolutely I still want to make one. I have no idea if I could even sell it, but for me personally, I love the form
If
so
if you do
much.
it right, you could probably sell it. I'll walk you through
Yeah.
it. I've made them. Actually, I made one last year. Was it I delivered one? Customer in Florida.
Did you
They've been
send me?
asking for years.
Oh, sure. I think I saw on your Facebook.
Yeah,
Uh,
that would have. I never got a commercial picture shot of it, but on my Facebook albums, it should be there.
yeah. Trying to see.
And I've done quite a few over the years. I've done several Kilige. To me, the later Kilige, or what they call a Pala, is one of the most complex Ottoman Turkish pieces.
Mm-hmm. Let's see if I can share this screen just to pull up. It's only part of the hilt
Okay.
and
Yeah,
and
there should be like long shots too, but whatever you can find, I can tell you if it's the right one. It probably is.
what is going on? Oh, here we go. Sorry, I'm still learning how all this screen sharing
Yeah,
stuff works. So this
that's
is
it.
only a portion of it, but
Right, that's
absolutely
it. Yeah,
beautiful. And
thank you.
then this is another picture that you shared in the
Hmm.
comments of the overall thing.
Right, right, yeah.
Yeah, so
And
cool.
that went to a guy who actually collects originals, and
Oh wow.
he he wanted one of mine, and he's bought a few pieces from me over the years, and he collects a
Hmm.
lot of Japanese stuff too. But
Yeah,
he liked that, so I've got it's actually displayed at his house next to an original.
really. Yeah, just and like this must be the sheet metal work you're talking about up
Hmm.
at the guard area,
Yeah, up along the guard, the bolsters are hollow. The scabbard fittings are all
right?
sterling.
That's so crazy. And this one, unfortunately, yeah, and all the like engraving and or
Mm.
is that engraving or is that
Yeah, it's actually engraving into the
okay?
silvers.
Yeah, so beautiful.
And then on the back side is that ridiculous coil stitching that they do.
Yeah, I was
The back of the scabbard.
yeah on your comment, you can kind of see that. Pull that
Yeah,
in,
it's yeah.
and that's with metal wire.
Hmm. One
Oh my
piece.
god. And so, how are you figuring that out? Are you just seeing pieces? Or are you getting
I've
feedback
seen.
from
I
other
actually have
people?
a shamshir in my collection that has
Okay.
that stitching. I could never quite figure out exactly how. And then there's a Turkish smith that I was kind of pushing in the right direction years ago when he was wanting to do stuff, and you know, he
Hmm.
would message me and I'd walk him through certain things I had done, and then he had done it. And so
Oh,
I
gotcha.
connected with him and I said, hey, how did you do this? And so he sent me a quick video of how he was doing it. It's like, okay, now it makes sense.
Right.
Because I
Okay.
had the sample in front of me on my shamshir and it was somewhat broken, so I could see how the wire
Oh,
was
okay.
one continuous wire. I just couldn't figure out how to conveniently coil it and connect it and coil it and connect it.
Well,
It's a tedious process.
well, I was gonna say, I was like, why did you think it was gonna be convenient?
Well, yeah.
It's, I think is so many things. It's especially like older and a piece like that is that's from like the 1600s, 1700s.
I would say probably 1700s,
Yeah,
that era.
yeah. Like they're just doing such incredible
Uh,
work.
the
And
Ottoman Turkish did some fantastic weapons and metalwork. Just like I say, the later, what I would consider like a late, or I guess early 19th century Pala, the Kilige with that radical bend in the blade,
oh
the
yeah, sure.
T back and the deep relief ricasso.
Yeah,
I've done one to that extent, and it was a ton of work, but I thoroughly enjoyed the whole process because of what I was able to capture in it.
right.
And
Yeah.
I actually had that at Blade Show one year. It's been
Oh,
probably
nice.
10 years ago now.
Kilish. And yeah, that work is really incredible. So I'm sorry, I'm just trying to like keep track of this. So so you did the can or you worked for a little bit, then you went to California, and that's where you really kind of started going full time. So how did it progress from, you just started doing one piece after the next after the next? How
Yeah,
did you build
basic.
up an audience? How did you sell your work? Like, how did that, a
Um,
lot of people are struggling right now with Instagram and on
right.
over on
There
Knife
was no
Talk.
Instagram back then.
Exactly.
There was
And I'm
like
like,
absolutely no. The only social media was word of mouth back then.
word of mouth or
Yeah,
magazines, maybe.
1981. American Blade, which became Blade Magazine,
Uh-huh.
started way back then. And, I had what kind of bumped me in the right direction early on too is in high school, I'd picked up a copy from, I think, 1972 of Guns and Ammo Book of Knives. It was a
Oh,
thin little book about like a thick magazine.
yeah.
And the whole thing was on knives, both antique knives and some of the modern makers like Ed Van Hoy,
Right.
the modern makers that nobody's heard of anymore.
Sure.
And then the Knives Annual started coming out, that Ken Warner was putting out,
Oh,
and
right.
what's his name, Lewis. He did the Knives Annuals. Ken Warner came out with Knives 81. I
Okay.
actually got a Scottish Dirk that I shot on the floor of my dad's workshop with a 110 camera. And I sent a picture off to Ken Warner, and it ended up in Knives 87.
Oh, wow.
But, like I say, to roll back to the marketing back then, we had a gun show every 6 months in Hawaii or in Honolulu. They still do it, actually. And most of the people I know, their kids now are adults doing that show. But
Oh, okay.
I went there, I sold knives, miniatures, whatever, a few antiques that I had bought and like restored.
Mm-hmm.
SCA was kind of one of the trickling incomes of, like I say, $20 a month, but didn't take a lot to survive back then. I think my rent was $100 a month for my shop. So,
Oh, wow.
um,
Yeah.
and then, doing the gun shows, and about that time, early 80s, there was a knife shop down in Waikiki. It was called Schaffner's World of Knives. It was I would say a small chain. He had like 2 or 3 stores. I think he was based out of Albuquerque, and they were
Oh,
right in the middle of Waikiki. And he sold like Jimmy Lyle's and things like that too. He was a good friend of Jimmy Lyle. So,
okay.
and so I would take anything I made, I could take down there and put on consignment. So that
Oh,
got a lot of my name out there because a lot of tourists would come in. And so I had a lot of knives ended up going all over the world, probably.
sure.
And that helped between those two. And then Rambo hit. And then
Okay.
Cold Steel came out with their Tonto about the same time that Rambo hit. And so Tontos and sawback survival knives
Okay.
were the thing, in the mid 80s.
Sure. And were you
And
making those styles?
oh yeah, of course you had to. I
You
couldn't
had to.
survive doing medieval daggers. In fact, I actually had a guy from New Zealand just contacted me. He lost his house last year in one of those huge wildfires.
Oh, sure.
And he said, "Hey, I've got these 2 knives that that I bought from you back in, geez, probably about 1985." And so he's sending them. They're on their way to me now to be fully restored because they got cooked in the fire. So,
Oh, wow.
and so one of them was one of them sawback survival knives.
No shit. That's
They're out there.
wild. That's gotta be crazy. What is it like to see work like that coming back? Just to like look at it and
It
be
it rarely happens.
sure.
I've had guys email me and say, "Hey, I picked up a knife at a yard sale or something that I think you made." I actually had a lady contacted me, said, "I found this dagger on a tree trunk outside of Fort Huachuca
What?
in Sierra Vista."
Just like
And
resting there or
yeah, and the thing is, what was weird is that it wasn't just a normal knife. It was one of those. I'm pretty sure it was one of the, the blade breaker left
oh
hand
yeah.
daggers. It's got all the little
Yep.
prongs. I only made one of those, and an
Oh,
SCA guy bought it. And the only thing I can figure is some military guy in the SCA. They were out camping or something outside Fort Huachuca, and he laid it down and forgot it was there.
oh wow.
That's
Bummer.
those weird things that they come back to haunt you sometimes.
Wild.
But I still got guys I hear from occasionally from the SCA way back in the early 80s that,
Mm-hmm.
like one guy has one of the first Cinquedea I ever made way back
Sure.
in like about 1984,
Yeah. Wow.
84, 85. And he still carries it and he still loves it for what it is.
Amazing. Right.
But it was probably like a $80 knife.
Oh my God.
Like I said, it didn't take a lot to survive back then.
Sure.
And none of
That's
the
fair.
guys had money anyway, because they were all part-timers going to schools.
I got you.
But it kept me going. It kept them interested, and it helped me to move forward. and
Yeah.
you know, my skills and everything, because grinders, you know, nobody had a real grinder back then. There weren't even really. We were just discussing that this morning. You know, when I started, the only full-time official bladesmith I could think of in Hawaii was Neil Kamimura's great-grandfather.
Right.
There were no knife makers. There was a guy named Zach who did pretty nice, almost Gil Hibben-like stuff back in the 70s, polished probably like 440 or something.
Yeah.
And then I think he went blind or something and retired or died or something. And that was, I remember as a kid seeing his knife shop.
Yeah.
But nobody's forged other than Neil's great-grandfather.
And so I've heard that you were at least familiar with him. Did you actually know his grandfather?
I met him once. His grandfather didn't really speak English.
Okay.
I met him once when we were moving from Honolulu to the Big Island. Grace and I stopped by his shop, and this would have been probably around 1989.
Okay.
I think. Yeah, we moved in 1990, probably 1989. We stopped in, showed him one of the knives I had worked on.
Mm.
And then he passed away, I want to say maybe about 1993.
Okay.
I went down to his shop. His shop was right in downtown Hilo. He made sugarcane harvesting knives out of L6.
Right.
And he, as far as I know, he edge hardened them, Japanese style.
Yeah.
And so his knives would outcut the standard off-the-shelf cane knife because they were mostly, you know, spring tempered, so you could sharpen them with a file.
I see.
And these guys' knives were hard edged. They would chop through sugarcane, which was pretty fibrous. And so when he died, I went because he had a power hammer there, and I was looking for a power hammer.
Okay.
And so I went, and his son Ken was, I guess, filling up some last orders for cane knives.
Okay.
He made cane knives, and he made little pickaxes, like little hand axes, that he sold at the local garden shop.
Okay.
And he would just forge the pieces, weld them onto a piece of conduit.
Oh, really?
That was the pickaxe. And they sold for like $10 at the local garden shop.
Sure.
And so I talked to the son, and he's like, well, you know, you can buy the shop from me after I'm done. But he wanted a whole lot of money for a very worn out workshop. And it's like, nah, I think I'll pass.
Mm-hmm.
And then I met his wife, his widow, because I was looking for coal, and he had some of the last coal left in Hilo.
Okay.
And so I bought what he had left, and then went to an auction of a friend of mine, a guy that I knew, bought the whole workshop for less than I was offered it for. And then that guy went bankrupt, and the whole thing went up for auction by the pallets.
Oh, wow.
And another guy I knew bought it. I was at the auction just watching to see how much that power hammer went for. It was like a 25-pound little giant. So
sure.
I didn't even know who bought it finally. But this guy bought a pallet of stuff, and in the pallet were 2 tanto blades.
Mm.
And so he said, hey, you can have one of them, because it was a pile of junk in the cardboard boxes. And he said, hey, you can have one of these tantos. So I took the tanto, not really thinking much of it. Right. Sat in my drawer for years and years. And I remember Mr. Kamimura's son telling me that he came to Hawaii as a swordsmith. He was trained as a swordsmith in Japan. Whether that's true or not, I don't know.
Sure.
But he told me that when he was a kid, they learned how to make Japanese swords and stuff in the shop.
Yeah.
I thought, well, okay, yeah, you know, nice story.
Yeah.
Never heard of a Kamimura Japanese sword in Hawaii.
Yeah.
But not that many years ago, I decided to finally polish up this tanto, and it actually was a laminated blade with a hamon.
Oh.
And I'm like, oh, this is a lot more advanced. It was varnished, and I'd written T. Kamimura on it.
Right.
So that if I ever died, somebody wouldn't just pick it up and go, oh, what is this old kitchen knife blade? Yeah. And it was like about maybe an 8-inch tanto blade.
Yeah.
And so I ended up giving it to Neil a couple of years back to realize it needed to be back in the family.
Yeah.
You know, and since there wasn't much of his great grandfather's work that had kept, you know, stayed in the family. So that was kind of a neat idea. But like I said, he was the only bladesmith that I could think of. And the few knife makers that started cropping up in the mid 80s thought I was crazy for forging.
Oh, really?
What a waste of time. You can just take a bar of steel and grind it.
Just grind it out. Yeah, sure. Wow, that is amazing. Well, and that had to have been kind of crazy for you to have met Neil and to have had that experience with his great grandfather?
Great grandfather, yeah.
Right. and then to connect him back
Mm-hmm.
to that family heritage in a way,
Mm-hmm.
especially with that Tonto. Um,
Yeah, and that was the whole thing. I
ah,
treasured that Tonto because it's like, wow, this is like a significant piece of Hawaiian bladesmithing history. But I
right.
realized it's like it wasn't doing me any good.
Mm,
It would mean more back in his family, and so
right.
I just cleaned it up, gave it to Neil.
Yeah. Well, especially now that Neil's, he's rock and rolling, forging
That's
away.
what I figured. Yeah, now that he's so famous, all that.
Yeah. That's so cool. Um, I was sorry. You had mentioned, oops, I don't know what I just did. Oh my God. I'm all of a sudden having a bunch of computer problems. Um, perfect. You'd mentioned Gil Hibben. Uh, was he in Hawaii or just his work was being sold in Hawaii?
No, it wasn't his work. It was a guy named Zach who did work that looked like Gil Hibben.
Oh, I got you.
Probably maybe even before Gil Hibben. I'm not sure. I just remember big, shiny, swoopy blades.
Yeah, so I didn't know what it was, so I just pulled up a picture. This is what I was able to find. Does this look like a Gil Hibben style knife?
That looked like a Gil Hibben style, but
Yeah.
this guy's name was Zach.
Okay.
And like I say, I remember going fishing with my brother and we walked by the shop and it said Zach's Knives. And as
Okay.
far as I know, he made everything.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
no,
it was that kind
just
of, it was
as a
those big
visual reference.
swoopy, yeah, right.
Yeah,
Those big swoopy, shiny blades from
I
what I
got
remember as like an 8-year-old or something.
I got you. And
There was
then
that styling back that would have been in the 70s, really.
yeah. And then I found a picture of the handle of the Yatagan. Let's see if I can pull that one up too. Just like a profile from the spine, so that
Mm-hmm.
so we can get a better idea of
Right. So you
what
get
that
the
looks like.
flare. Yeah.
Yeah.
That one was kind of limited by the size of the ivory, too.
Yeah. Yeah. You
Is
still
that
got.
even, that's actually a different one.
Oh, that's a different one.
That's an even different one. Yeah.
Okay.
That's,
Perfect.
I think that's one of the earlier ones I did,
Okay.
I would guess.
But that's the
Maybe,
very
maybe not, but
that's a
that's a classic smaller eared one. I did one in buffalo horn that had the really wide butterfly wings on it.
right.
Or I call them butterfly wings.
Sure. But that is a very important feature kind of on those
Oh yeah, yeah.
Ottoman.
That's part
Isn't that
of
Ottoman?
that's Ottoman, yes.
Yeah, style. Yeah, this is pretty amazing. Okay, so you are okay. So you're obvious. So at this point in our story, you're pretty well established as a solid maker.
Hmm.
Oh, we were talking about like marketing and getting your name out there,
Right, yeah.
and because so many people are struggling right now, and and we keep getting this question over on Knife Talk. What do I do? What do I do? I'm like, what did people do before Instagram or
It,
even Facebook? You got to think back to that, and it's like people underestimate the value of the grassroots and slow growth or word of mouth growth because it's slow. But the thing is that the people that are sharing your
hmm
work via word of mouth,
hmm
those exchanges are actually a lot more valuable, I think, than thousands of people seeing a post. Because
Well,
sure, 1,000 people can see it,
definitely.
but it doesn't necessarily mean that any of them are interested. But if somebody who loves or admires your work is sharing with somebody who admires and is interested in potentially buying some of that style work,
Hmm.
that is a direct one-to-one. So like
Oh yeah, yeah.
that
And
leads to potential sale pretty quick.
back then, like you say, back then we had no choice. Yeah,
Right.
there was no, I remember back even in the 90s,
Mm,
pre-internet really,
yeah.
someone would call you up and say, hey, I saw a picture of one of your knives, in Blade magazine.
Right.
Say, can you send me some pictures of what you have available? That entailed taking a film camera, shooting a bunch of pictures, going down to a 1-hour photo, developing
Right.
them, putting them in an envelope, and mailing it to the guy. There was no internet. There was no
There's no
instant
email.
here.
You didn't just
Right. There was
blast
no
it out
like,
the
okay, give me
email.
5 seconds, I'll shoot a picture,
Right.
And so, to me, going to craft fairs, going to gun shows, going to whatever's local.
Yeah.
For one thing, a lot of people, I'd have a hard time buying a knife sight unseen just off of Instagram.
Sure.
Something cold, you don't even know the maker. You've got
Right.
a little thumbnail picture of him. If you go to a craft fair where the person can talk to you, I've sold a lot of knives at craft fairs back in Hawaii. Christmas. I belonged to it was called Pacific Handcrafters Guild, and it was I guess you would say it was in a way a juried group. You
Okay.
couldn't just join. They had to you had to submit like 5, kind of like the ABS. You had to
Yeah, being
submit
like
5
voted in.
pieces, right? Voted in, basically,
I
yeah.
got you.
And they did like 4 craft fairs a year, and so every 3 months there was always a fair going on.
Right.
And so you take a booth and make up, and I would, between that and the gun shows, is really how I survived.
Yeah.
Literally getting out in the public with your work so they can touch it, talk to you,
Yeah.
find out your story, find out how you make it. And to me, that means a lot more, because a lot of it is you need the experience of interacting with the people physically, face to face. That's what I love about doing things like Blade Show. To me,
Okay.
it's the interaction with people, because people are like, oh, I heard so much about you. It's nice to finally see your work in person. I get
Sure.
that a lot. So yeah, pictures are one thing, internet's one thing, going to a show, meeting the person, seeing their work, physically looking at it. And even like when I would, make a knife for somebody or a sword, and I send it to them after I've sent them update pictures all along the way, and they're like, oh, it looks so much better in person. It's like, well, yeah,
Right.
because
For
the
sure.
internet never really justifies it, unless you get like someone like Coop to shoot your pictures. Then he really
Sure.
captures the details that
Yeah.
you can't capture quite as well.
Right.
But yeah, face to face is really, like I say, that's why I always tell people. I've got a student back in Hawaii, and it's like, do the gun show. People need to know who you are.
Yeah.
Just,
Yeah. I've gotten I do a Q&A for the Patreon, and I've had people ask, how do I get the most out of my social media? And it goes right back to the tried and true of what you're saying, is to you can show pictures all you want, but those are very stale, stagnant, lifeless things without a person to tie them to, without a personality, a character, any kind of additional, I guess, value to tie it to. And while the platforms might change from markets to trade shows to Facebook, Instagram, whatever, or even forums, the approach should still almost always be the same, which is like, tell your story, who you are, what was going through your mind and your thought process when you were building this thing. And it gives a potential client or customer something more tangible, more valuable than just the object to tie to the potential to the purchase.
right.
Because I think people ultimately want to buy, sorry, let me back up. If it's just a comparison, like if two similar things but they have nothing else to compare other than prices, people are always going to go for the lower price.
Right.
And so by telling your story and sharing who you are and your process, and getting to know that person kind of on a little bit more personal level, you're adding more value, so that even though your stuff might be a little bit more expensive, because of who you are as a person and as a creator and as a craftsperson, that is going to draw somebody towards you more, and also help them feel more, I guess, willing to spend that extra money because of that connection that they have with you.
Right. I think it helps them to understand, like you say, there's a lot more depth to making a piece than, oh, I saw this knife, I wanted to copy it, so I 3D printed all the fittings and stuck it all together. It's like it lacks the personal investment of time and experience and mistakes. Mistakes are a lot of the learning process. Like Steve Schwartz says, you make a lot of mistakes, but you learn from everything.
Hopefully.
Yeah, you should. If you don't learn, then you keep repeating them.
Yeah, exactly.
What was it? Isn't that the definition of insanity? Making the same mistake and expecting a different outcome.
Different result. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Since we're there, what has been your relationship with mistakes and with hard lessons learned, or even, I don't know if you like struggle with perfectionism, especially with like all the fine details that you're putting into your work. How do you give yourself the permission to keep moving forward when things maybe sometimes aren't always exactly how you want them to be? Because that's something I personally struggle with, and I'm sure a lot of people struggle with.
I guess when you look at originals and you realize, you look at, let's say, just pull like a 15th, 16th century rapier, Italian rapier, right? Beautifully chiseled, all that kind of stuff. When you start really looking at it, realize it's not perfect.
Right.
It's beautiful. It's organic. You can tell it was made by somebody, but it's not perfect. And, so obviously I do my best. I try to do the best I can in all the work that I'm doing, but
Right.
every time I'm done and I go, wow, what a nice piece. Next one's going to be better because there's always something that's not quite right. And you can't back up, you know.
Yeah.
You cut something away, it's not going back on. You know, and even, you know, forge welding, pattern welding and all that. You know, I did my first pattern welded. I started with cable because I think Wayne Goddard, somebody put out an article in Blade years ago.
Sure.
Probably about 84, 85. A friend of mine, knife maker back in Hawaii, used to work for a tugboat company. So he was bringing me pieces of like tugboat cable.
Yeah.
And so I started welding it up, and that gave me a good feel for forge welding. I mean, forge welding is forge welding. It's like my dad forge welded all the time.
Yeah.
You know, it's just a process of attaching steel to steel. And so the concept of folding it and all that was an intriguing idea. And it was really just starting to become more commonplace in the mid 80s. You were seeing it more in the magazines. And so, you know, you learn that a friend of mine rode a motorcycle and he brought me the chain. He said, you think you can weld this up? Because he liked processes, you know, he studied jewelry and all that. And he figured, why couldn't you weld up a motorcycle chain? So I welded up a motorcycle chain probably in like 85.
Oh, wow.
It's in my book.
I
could go back.
Yeah, and I'm just
I could go back in my records, but it's not fun.
I imagine.
It's not fun. Somewhere on my back, I have a burn mark in the shape of a link.
Oh, shit.
Forge welding it, and one of the links, you know, flipped up and landed on my back, and you can't stop, right? If you stop, you screw up the weld. But it's like welding a sponge. It's because it's just full of tubes and holes and everything until it gets solid. It gives an interesting pattern. And so I welded that up, and I remember my first Damascus blade was, I want to say New Year's Eve. I was wearing what we in Hawaii call rubber slippers, you know, flip-flops by American standards. Not a good idea, you know. But that was when I made my first pattern welded blade, and I believe it was 85. It's all in my books. Everything I do has got a serial number. Whether it's on the piece or not, it's serial numbered in my book with a full description.
Interesting.
All the way back to knife number 1, which I still have.
That's amazing.
And my folders are numbered separately.
I got you. All right, let's pause right there because we need to talk about this. You've been keeping records of every single piece that you've ever made. First off, why did you even decide to start doing that? And then what does that look like? Are they in photo albums? Are they handwritten notes on pages? Like, what does it look like?
I started doing that because I guess I thought, shouldn't you?
Sure.
Right? Knife number 1, you should write as number 1, and then number 2 should be number 2. Now that didn't include miniatures, because miniatures, I made hundreds and hundreds of miniatures. But starting with the first full-size knife, which I made for myself because I wanted something for going out in the bush and I couldn't afford. I wanted a case Bowie knife, those great big one with the brass back on it.
Yeah.
Couldn't afford it, so I made myself something that was a hybrid kukri bolo. Made out of a 2.5 spring.
Whoa.
You could split coconuts with it. Let's say that. It was heavy, very sharp. But like I said, I still got it. It's very sharp. It's got beautiful curly koa scales because I didn't know any better.
Whatever.
And I had a woodworker. Well, I had a woodworker friend, and you know, he would bring me scraps and cuttings from his furniture. So you know, koa was not a rare commodity when back then, because he had a dumpster.
Oh, wow.
Just go through the dumpster and find all the cuttings and stuff.
Yeah.
But where were we going with all that? Oh yeah, the numbering, right?
So the record keeping,
it's just a composition book, you know, those ones that you use in school.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And I just divided each page into like grids of, you know, the date, one section for description, and then a place to check off if it was a commission, and then the year that it sold.
Okay.
Month, years that it sold. But if I knew the year, if I knew where it sold, otherwise I'd put like the name of the knife shop if I didn't know who bought it.
Okay.
And sometimes if it would change hands and the person contacted me, I would just correct it in the book. I
got you.
So I'm at somewhere around 1700 1740 something, maybe. I want to say I just did like 1749 or so.
Wow. Oh, so you got 1750 is going to be a big one.
Somewhere there about, I don't know. Maybe. I don't know if the Schiavone I'm working on is that, or if I've already passed it and I'm just forgetting, but it's somewhere in that 1700 range.
Oh, that's so interesting. And do you keep photographs of all those works with them as well?
Not with them. In the more recent works, I do keep, in general, I shoot pictures of everything. Everything's digital now. Back when it was filmed, no.
Right.
I've got pictures of early work, but
Yeah.
not every piece I did. And then, like I said, my folders were all on a separate grid, and they were all marked with an F and then the numbers.
Right.
And
You so I kind of keep notes now with my wife, because my wife helps with is part of the business, and she helps with kind of keeping me organized so that I can just focus on the making, because
right,
otherwise I'm all over the place.
yeah,
And every week we take notes, and part of the notes is me just talking about like what I've been working on the last week. But if on particular builds, I'm making kind of what would be kind of mental notes, but I know my trying to be self-aware that I will not remember these mental notes. I
hmm
She helps. I dictate, and she's just like a stenographer. She's just
okay, yeah,
and she's taking notes of like processes of like
okay, yeah,
mistakes
yeah.
I made, and
hmm
how to correct them or how to approach them differently in the future. Do you keep those kind of notes as well along with those
That
builds, or
that's a
is that a
different
whole
book.
nother
That's a different
okay.
book. I do have a book of like you say, processes that I've
Yeah,
done for a specific project, and I'll write what this year was, what the project was,
sure.
what I started with, what my goal was, what I finished with, whether it was a mistake, what to
Sure.
change next time, especially when you get into like migration and Anglo-Saxon pattern welding,
Right, sure.
especially if you're trying to replicate, say, the Sutton Hoo sword,
Okay.
okay, which I was asked to do a blade for the Sutton Hoo sword,
Right.
and it needed to be what the original was. The proportions had to be what the original was. The X-ray, what I did had to match the X-ray. And
Hmm.
so, I contacted the British Museum and I said, hey, I've been asked to, replicate the Sutton Hoo blade. Um, do you have any information? And they're like, well, contact Scott Langton or read Scott Langton's article. And I'm like, I don't
Is this
really want to replicate Scott Langton's sword. I want to replicate the original.
right? Is this the Sutton
So
Hoo?
no,
It's not.
is
Oh, okay.
that's the Altoona.
Oh,
Same era.
okay.
That's in Sweden. That's the Altoona sword.
I'm gonna find it. I know I was going through your pictures the other
I've
day.
got a whole album on Facebook for Sutton Hoo.
Oh,
And
okay.
Sutton Hoo has specifics because it's a specific blade
Right.
that was found, and the guy that asked me to do it basically wanted as close as could be an exact replica of what was dug out of the ground.
Right.
And what Scott Langton did was pioneering work, but I needed it to match exactly what the original relic was, not what Scott Langton had done.
I gotcha.
And so I had a copy of the X-ray, or yeah, I guess it wasn't from the British Museum specifically. I think it was from Scott's article, and I just
Okay.
examined that. And then I actually did go to London and met up with my friend who wanted the blade made, and we went to the British Museum. And Janet Lang, the lady who had done all the analysis on Sutton, who happened to be in there that day in the lab, and so we went up. I'm trying to remember. Peter Johnson may have been with
Oh,
us,
wow. What a
and so we went up and looked at the X-rays because I had come up with a concept that they had split the core.
oh, interesting.
And
Okay.
because when you look at the X-ray of the Sutton Hoo, a twist, because of the phosphorus, that's the only thing really they said still exists inside the Sutton Hoo block is
Okay.
phosphorus in the iron oxide. And the phosphorus is what's replicating the pattern. Because
Right.
Janet Lang told me they had actually X-rayed Scott Langton's replica, and you couldn't see the pattern. He used wrought iron, but it didn't have phosphorus in it, so the pattern didn't even show up in
Oh,
the X-ray.
right.
And
And
so
it's the phosphorus that causes it to have a contrast
it
in
right
pattern.
that it shows up as a white fuzzy lines. And so I kept
Yeah.
looking at the X-ray and saying, there's something wrong in this. And I realized that if you have like a helix, a
Yeah.
twist of phosphorus, it's going to show up as a helix in the X-ray.
Right.
Excuse me. But there's no helix. All you've got is a herringbone pattern.
Uh-huh.
And so I asked, Janet Lang, I said, I'm not seeing the twist. And she says, well, that's just the way it is. I said, that doesn't work. If
Right.
there's a helix of phosphorus, it's going to show up in the X-ray as a helix of phosphorus.
Right.
And so I surmised that they somehow had either split the core or ground literally half of it away.
Oh, wow.
And so I welded up 4 rods. I did test samples. This all goes back to my book of keeping records. I did test samples of, for one thing, the twist sequence, because my lengths of twists and straights have to match the X-ray. Because you're replicating a historical piece, not making something up based on.
Sure.
And in the process of doing that, I literally split the 4 rods in half this way and did this and put it back together.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And in the process of splitting it, you take out that star in the center of the twist rod.
Yeah.
And that had a lot to do with making it look more like what the X-ray was showing.
Oh, interesting. That historical replication stuff is so cool.
It gets trickier doing that because you have a lot more parameters you have to work in.
Well, you have to fit inside of.
Right.
Because you're thinking of it from the perspective of what they would have had available to them technologically, and what and techniques and tools and equipment, or that would have been available to them. How do you? Oh, gosh. Like I think from what I've seen, and I don't know if I'm necessarily qualified to make this statement, but I would say, in my experience and what I've seen, that you're probably at least the best sword maker in the United States. You and Peter Johnson are probably 2 of the most talented sword makers I've seen. There's Robert Mock.
Robert Mock is really good. I really like his work.
Doing some really incredible stuff. He's over in Russia, is that?
I want to say Czech Republic.
Okay, Czech.
I'm thinking he's Czech Republic.
There's a couple other guys doing really good stuff, but I would say you're easily top 5 in the world for European swords.
Right, yeah.
For your
most likely, I mean, who am I to say? There may be people we never heard of.
Sure, that's totally fair. They do a good job working in their shop and never popular. But work maybe ends up in people's collections all over.
Right.
That's true. But I guess the people that are out there, the people whose work is visible, from what I've seen, you're definitely one of the top makers in the world. I don't know if that even really has any value to you, because it seems like your goal is just to kind of satisfy this creative curiosity and exploration, which I think is really awesome that you've been able. It seems like that's what your approach is, and that you've been able to build a business for yourself, and or at least a level of success for yourself, so you can continue this exploration.
Yeah, and that's really, to me, the fun part. The recognition, whatever. It's humorous because maybe in the field I am recognized, but when you get outside the field, your family's like, they have no clue what you do. You always see those memes of on Facebook about what I think I do, what my family thinks I do.
Right. What I actually do.
Yeah.
Super funny.
But it's like I said, the challenge for me is like doing a Cinquedea. It's such a complex piece.
Right.
I enjoy all the aspects of doing it.
Yeah.
Trying in a way to walk in the footsteps of masters of the past. It's like, thinking what they had to work with compared to what we have to work with. Absolutely. How did they do it?
Yeah.
And then trying to capture it like an original, not based on, inspired by, but totally off.
Yeah.
A friend of mine said that the work needs to, feel familiar in the hand of an ancient warrior. In other words, you can't do something that to you looks like a Viking sword, but if you handed it to a warrior from the 10th century, he's going to say, what in the world is this? What were you thinking? This looks nothing like, or feels nothing like what we had,
Right. Oh, that's so cool.
And to me, that's the aspect when I do my work is I look at what they did, try to figure out what they did, try to understand all the aspects of what they went through to do it, and then try to replicate what they did, really honoring them.
Yeah. Because they're coming from a background of hundreds, if not hundreds of years of oral history, honestly, right? And passed down tradition from master to apprentice, that then was probably lost for a little bit, or maybe just carried by different parts of the world, or slowed
probably
down. But I really like that idea of, when creating a sword or an ancient weapon or replicating one to make it as true to the originals in the way that you could somehow pass it on to the to an ancient
Right,
warrior,
right.
and they'd be like, "Yep, this is it."
Hmm.
That's pretty incredible. You brought up the Cinquedea
Cinquedea, yeah.
a couple times now, so let's pull that up and let's talk about it. And you just won Best of Show at Solvang, I believe, is the one
Solvang, yes.
you
Yes,
sent in the
that's the one,
email.
yes. Hmm.
All right, so I'm gonna pull that up, and so this is for the overall view. There is a lot, especially where with the fullering work that's going on, and I'm going to zoom in here in a second, but we'll just take a second with the overall view. And can you explain what this is, where it comes from in history, and where in the world it comes from?
It's a Venetian Cinquedea from about 1550. What's odd is they say this knife sword, whatever you want to call it, really only lasted about 50 years. It's
Oh
not a
wow,
huge window of time that this particular style was used or carried.
I gotcha.
They're basically short swords, really big daggers, very wide bladed. Cinquedea means 5 fingers.
5 fingers. And
Yeah, in other
how
words,
wide was that blade? How long was
this
it?
one's about 3.5, maybe.
Oh, cool.
It's
Okay.
in my records, 3.5, maybe
Yeah.
3 3/4. And the concept was that the width of the hilt was basically 5 fingers wide. And
I
they
got
had
you.
various series of fullers. This one is 5 4 3 2. I've seen 5 4 3 2 1. I've seen 2.
Okay.
And they're always well, not always. The ones that only have 2 fullers generally run all the way down. Normally they're segmented. So you've got 5 4 3 2 on this one.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great
Wow.
fun to do. Very
That's a nice way of putting it. I'm sure.
challenging to lay it out and grind it correctly. I do all the finish grinding on the fullers after the blade's been hardened,
Sure.
mainly
That makes
because if the steel is soft, it's too easy for the wheel to grab and drag over the top of your webbing there and mess up your
Oh, I
lines.
got you.
So I'll rough
So
everything in, but I'll leave like flats between the fullers until
yeah,
after
I
I've
got
heat
you.
treated it.
So that way that the abrasive, oh, that's a nice tip actually. So the abrasive slides rather than drags
Right, right.
pulls.
'Cause you know how you'll be grinding and sometimes it'll want to jerk down because the
Yeah,
abrasive is
totally.
too aggressive. So if the blade's hardened already, you have a lot more resistance to it actually dragging on you. And
Yeah,
I set up my grinding table,
I got you.
so I can adjust the height of it gradually as I need. It's a very complex build because the guard is actually 2 pieces brazed together that slides over the top.
Okay.
It slides from the point up. If you look at the back of the guard there, you can actually see the profile of the end of the tank of the end of the blade. That's
Oh,
actually
okay.
the blade. That center area is
Let
actually
me
the
see if I
blade.
can zoom in a little bit closer there.
Yeah, that's actually the back edge of the blade.
Oh, wow.
So the guard slides up on
Oh,
the
I see it
front.
with the engraving, with that
Right,
chevron
right,
kind
yeah,
of engraving.
yeah. Hmm.
Oh,
Those are
wow.
leaves, yeah. And then there's 2 pins that
Holy
go through the guard and the base of the blade and pin the guard down onto the base of the blade.
Is that at the bottom of around the E, you have, oh
No,
gosh,
the pins
pins.
the
Okay.
pins are in that first set of scrolls to either side of that curled leaf.
Yeah. Okay.
That's where the pins are. They're hidden in the engraving. I pin it down, then I go back and I re-engrave and connect all the.
Yeah, no, that's great.
So
That's
when I
super
actually
smart.
do the engraving, there's a hole through the guard where the guard is being engraved. There's a hole where the pin will go. So I just
I
draw
see.
my pattern right over that, and then after I pin it down, I go back and I just kind of cut it in.
Amazing. And then the way you work the engraving on the bottom side of the guard, like I don't see. Well, and I guess you said that it's soldered together, right? Silver
No, it's just
soldered.
slipped. It's just slipped. Oh yeah, the 2 tips of the guard, the areas
Yeah.
where the guard comes together are silver soldered, hard soldered.
Right.
And then but it's such a fine line, you never actually see it. And then when you engrave
Sure.
it, even more so, you don't see it.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing. And
And
all
then
this engraving work, are you using? Is it hand and chisel or?
I got a Graver Max.
I got you.
Not some of it's done by hand, but majority of it's done with the Graver Max, which
Yeah.
isn't cheating because he still got to do the work. All it
You
does is
still gotta
hammer
do.
for you. Yeah, you don't just step on the pedal and it engraves for you while you're off getting a cup of coffee or something. It's
That's fair. Yeah, I hear
everybody's like,
people.
"Oh, you're cheating." It's like you're not cheating. It just gives you one extra hand. That's all it does.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just like, I'm looking at the leaves around these floral elements, like right in the middle of the handle.
Yeah, and those are
I,
actually the washers for the rivets.
right. Oh my God. That's so good.
And then you've got
the,
the tang actually has a false tang band. That brass or bronze tang band is soldered to the tang of the blade itself.
okay.
And so the wood is inset down into it. Same way that the
Oh,
Turkish
really?
hilts are done, yeah.
Oh, interesting.
And then that horseshoe pommel slides over the top and holds the end of it all together. And then there's a little stub
Hmm.
of a tang that pinned over the top.
Oh,
So
interesting.
that
So
horseshoe pommel is actually hollow as well.
I
Like I
got
said, it's
you.
a very complex bill. If you go back all the way to Bill Moran talking about them, and he said there's like 30 pieces to the hilt, and that's about right. Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay. So the tang comes out of the bottom of the blade and it continues all the way through the bottom of the handle.
Right. It's all one piece.
Okay.
It's shaped, the shape of the tang, basically what you see there is the shape, except slightly narrower to allow for the
I
sheet
see.
bronze to wrap around that.
I got you. And then the wood's captured inside of that.
The
What
wood's
is
captured right to
is it pretty much flush or is there just the slightest step between the
it
bronze
it
into the
it's
wood?
the wood is stepped down behind the bronze.
Yeah.
You've got
Wow.
like a good 16th inch or more of the
Okay.
wood that stepped down into the bronze,
I
and
got
then
you.
same thing on that arched pommel. The
Yeah.
wood is stepped down so that when that horseshoe slips over the top, it actually holds the wood in place as well.
Amazing.
Yeah,
Oh my
it's a
God.
complex build to do it right, but
God.
it's fun. This is like my third one, if you don't count the one I did back in '85.
For $80.
Yeah, for 80
Cheap.
bucks, which really wasn't bad considering what it was, and it even
Sure.
had the segmented fullers way back then.
Oh wow.
I was ambitious. I didn't know any better.
And so you're doing that after it's hardened. Are you using stones, like dye polishing stones to get in there, or you're
To
just
finish it out, I use a
yeah.
varying sizes of contact wheels.
Okay.
And if you examine the piece, you realize that those fullers are all tapered.
Oh wow. Oh, you're
The only
right.
one that's not tapered is that center one on the top. I think that's the only
At the
fuller
top.
that's not centered. Just that center
Oh
one.
yeah, I can see.
All
Yeah,
the others taper.
I got you.
Everything else tapers because it's got to follow the taper of the blade.
Right. And
So the next step,
are you marking that all out? And you must be.
yeah, I forge the blade, I grind it, flatten it, put my bevels in, and then I spray the whole thing with Dicom, and I go back with a carbide scribe, and I
Hmm.
lay out where the fullers start, where they stop, where the center lines are.
Oh my God. And because you're working at a tip, I'm just realizing, especially down at the tip, like there's a potential that you might accidentally towards the tip cross over that center line, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God.
It's fun, like I
Because
say,
it's
and
not
that
straight
tip
down
gets
the length.
that tip
It's
gets narrow
follow
and deep, so that when you get down to the tip, you pretty much have to work it by hand.
right. Oh my God.
It's a ton of work, and then after it's all ground, then you go back with EDM stones and
Yeah.
little steel rods with sandpaper, and you hand polish everything up. I
Holy
just
smoke.
I'm I just I'll have a blade on the table
Yeah.
um in Atlanta that's a Schiavona that has a similar blade.
Okay.
Fuller wise, I've got her sitting right here next to me because I was working on it,
Yeah.
and it's a sword blade, and it's got segmented, and that one's the fullers are crazy on that one because the bevels change.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it'll be on my table in Atlanta.
Well, and that's something I feel like I've seen, and I can't remember if it's either Indian, yeah, Indian work or Ottoman or Turkish work.
You'll see Indo-Persian work will do that.
Okay.
Ottoman,
With all these various like hollows
yeah,
and
the Indo-Persians did a lot of the multi-segmented. So you see it on Qatars,
right.
um,
God,
Peshkabs, you see more of the panel blades than you do the segments, but you'll see
sure.
Persian and Indo-Persian pieces will have segmented fullers a lot of times.
That's an insane piece.
Great
I'm
fun.
not surprised it won for best of show. And what's great is that people understand, the people that are judging understand what they're looking at. I think that's
Well,
the hardest thing about shows these days.
what's the
It's like
nice thing
who's
about
judging?
Solvang? The
Yeah.
table holders are the judges.
Oh.
There's no judge. It's table holders voting,
Hmm.
and there were probably 20 pieces entered. It was a fun
Okay.
show actually. And Solvang was a really fun show.
How
Small
many
show, but
Oh, sorry, go ahead. How many table
Um,
holders were there?
yeah, I want to say they had 80. I want to say they had upped it from last year,
Okay.
but yeah, it somewhere in the 50, 50 to 80 range, maybe. Not. It was a pretty small show, intimate show.
Okay.
The town is really cool. The town's worth going to see in itself. So, you
Oh,
come with
really?
your wife. Your wife can go running off to town while you're
Sure.
buying knives.
Yeah.
Good
Wow.
restaurants, coffee shops.
I
But the
got you.
show, what they were trying to do is they wanted just a purely custom show, no vendors of materials or
Oh, interesting. Okay.
it was purely custom knife show. Dennis Friedley and Jim Sornberg are the ones that were kind of pushing it because it used to be a really good show years ago. You couldn't get in unless somebody else died. That was the only way a table
Oh,
would come
wow.
available. And
Sure.
so I was on the list for years. It used to be run by Nordic Knives.
Okay.
And they just kind of, Jim and Dennis restarted it, was it last year, a couple years back maybe? And it's just fun. It was, you had time to talk to other makers. Sales weren't bad, could have been better, but you're regrowing kind of a niche boutique kind of a show.
Sure.
But you had some top makers in the country there.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one of the things, it was like we were talking about earlier about kind of going back to the old school way of marketing is doing shows. But one of the biggest values I think that you get from going to show is seeing other people's work firsthand,
mhm,
and also the opportunity to network and develop relationships with other makers, especially makers who have skills you don't have or more experience than you, because then
mhm.
as you develop that friendship or that acquaintanceship at least, then potentially you can lean on those people when you get to a point where like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing here, or I've tried three, four different ways and I'm still struggling with it. Do you have any insight, you know?
The first knife show I did outside of Hawaii was California Custom, was put on by
Okay.
Plaza Cutlery.
Okay.
And eye-opening and terrifying
Sure.
because this is all obviously, again, pre-social media, pre-internet.
Yeah.
So the only knife reference I had was what I saw in pictures or the few
Oh,
other
right.
makers in
So
Hawaii.
you're like going in
So to
blind.
suddenly go blind into this custom show with big name makers, and you're like, especially when like some of them are, purveyors come up and they're like, oh, this is really nice. You're doing well. You might want to clean up that solder joint. They gave you good constructive
Right.
criticism. But coming from like a big name purveyor or collector, it's a little intimidating.
That is
But
crazy.
that's
I
what
never even,
pushes you forward. Nowadays, it's like
yeah,
you can learn so much just off the internet that you go in there with really nice work from the beginning. But
sure.
when you're coming out of nowhere into an environment like that, but again, I had a lot of customers in California, and it forces you to say, okay, next time I go to that show, my solder joints better be cleaned up better.
Right.
I was going by Randall knife pattern, standards for solder,
I got you. Okay.
that nice thick fillet.
I got you.
And these guys are like, no, we don't want to see a solder line. It's like,
Yeah.
oh, okay.
Interesting. Yeah. I never even thought about that aspect of not knowing what work people there, because it really at that point was a reveal of people's kind of like best
Yeah,
work that they were bringing, and nobody knew what anybody was bringing
that's the
because
thing, right?
the
It's
lack
you,
of
you
social
didn't have
media and
right.
internet and email
If you
even
weren't
maybe.
doing the shows the other guys were at, you had no clue what their knives looked like.
Wow.
And
Oh
even
man.
now, when I for years at Blade Show, I sat farther back on row 17, and I was across from a lot of the ABS guys that had come for judging.
Okay.
And so, I mean, obviously, your work had to be nice just to bother going for judging.
Sure.
But you look at them and you feel kind of sorry because they're sitting there and they're like, wow, I jumped through all the hoops, I became a journeyman or whatever, and
Yeah.
nobody's buying my stuff.
Mm.
And it's like, part of the reason is because it looks like the work of the guy you just learned from.
Sure.
Is that you got to find your own path, and yet they want to charge the price
Mm.
that the guy they learned from is charging, and it's like you're not there yet. You don't have experience. Your work is clean, but you don't have experience. You don't have reputation.
Right.
You've been doing it for a whole 2 years. It's
Sure.
like I've been doing this now. Geez, what, 43 years?
Holy shit.
Jeez, makes me feel really old.
Don't feel old. I
I
think I
well,
didn't.
the thing is, I started out of high school, so what can I say? I started young.
You started. Yeah, you started. You've been going at it for a long time. What year were you born? Can I ask you that?
62.
All right, I know how old you are then.
Yeah,
That's
it's
I
not hard to figure the math on that. I can do that much math. I know how old I am, or I will be.
I always prefer to ask when people were what year they were born rather than ask how old they are, because
Yeah.
people are more happy to give up the year they're
Oh
born
yeah, yeah.
rather than how old they are. Not that you have an issue with it, but
No, I
that's
don't.
just my. It's also like a mental math game I like to play with
I'm
myself.
somewhere in that 62 range, but I won't be 62 till later in the year. So I'm still
Sure,
61.
I got
But
you.
again, like I said, I started at such a young age that
Right.
I guess it's good fortune that I made a lot of the mistakes a long time ago. Not that I'm not
Yeah.
still making mistakes. I've got lots of proof in my shop of bits and pieces here and there, and lots of mistakes that you still make because you're still exploring, you're still learning.
Yeah.
And there's, like we say when you and I discuss the secrets of what those silly German smiths were doing in the 2nd century AD
Yeah.
at Illerup, and it's like I think I know what they're doing, and when I get back from Atlanta, if I can squeeze out a day, I'm gonna try one more concept that I think may have been what they did.
Sure.
But then you still got to figure out how to get it all assembled and hold together long enough to get it all welded together
Yeah.
without using modern principles beyond what are a modern version of what they would have used. In other words, no boxes full of powder. This is
Right.
assembling loose pieces, holding it together long enough to weld it together, because it's
Right.
got to be done the way they did it, or you haven't proven it.
Right.
To replicate it using non-conventional things like what they didn't have isn't really doing what they did.
Right.
You get into pattern development, playing with powders and all that, that's a totally different story. That's a totally different field. But to try and
Exactly.
replicate what they did with it, to some extent, the resources. Obviously, I'm not using
Sure.
the alloys they use because I really don't want to work with phosphor iron just because, but trying to replicate
You're not going
it.
to smelt your own steel? What are you even doing?
I use the best I have available. They use the best they had available.
That's
High
fair.
phosphorus iron is not necessarily that practical in modern day knife making. So,
Yeah.
but the mechanic to reproduce it mechanically, I guess would be the best way to put it.
Sure.
To me means a lot more than replicating it using all the modern technology.
Yeah.
You can probably, what I would call, is probably, I don't want to say it, but faking it using the modern techniques. Just like, hey, let's print up, let's EDM or whatever the pattern I see, and then fill it
Oh.
full of powder
Yeah,
and
I
weld
got
it
you.
into a block. It's not the same as mechanically scratching your head and figuring out how in the world did they do this.
No.
You
Yeah.
know,
Well,
2,000 years ago. How did they do mosaic Damascus 2,000 years ago?
yeah. Well, and I think if somebody were to use that kind of modern approach, they're missing out on a lot of the natural distortion that occurs in forging a bar down,
And I
which
think that's
the
what
patterns
caused the
actually
pattern.
benefited
Yeah,
from.
I think that was what caused the pattern, was a natural distortion and an accidental discovery of that concept. It's like, oops, look what we did. Hey, that's an interesting pattern. Let's run with that now.
So we just jumped onto a massive tangent, and then I think people are like, "What the hell are they talking about?"
Yeah, they're like,
So
get out of here. Get out of here
I'll,
now. Go back to
I'll,
your hole.
I'll do a small introduction, and then I would love to hear you fill in, because I'm sure I'm missing stuff. But essentially, in the 1850s, as far as or sorry, that's for Illerup, or maybe that was Nydam. But anyways, in Danish bogs, there were graves, sacrificial graves, as well as
It was actually a
weapon
swamp.
sacrifices
Yeah, it was a swamp. Yeah.
that were discovered. And I think from what I was reading, like there was a farmer in the area that would find these things and he'd give them to the kids and stuff like that. And then somebody was like, "What's the deal with these swords?" And they went and dug a little bit deeper and they just found tons of them. But one of the big things that they were finding, along with the swords and sword belts and combs and all these day-to-day items, but they were finding these swords that had very unique patterns on them that didn't make sense and have continued to confound people essentially since they were first unearthed in the 1850s to the late or very early 1860s, before like things basically shut down because of, I think, World War One stuff, or like civil war within that area, and then things didn't really pick up again until like I think the 1980s. Is that right?
It sounds about right. Yeah.
Right,
What you got to do, you got to roll
1970s.
it back to the opening scenes of the movie Gladiator,
Right. Okay. Let's
where
hear it.
he's fighting the German Celts. That's the
Oh,
battle
right,
situation where all the swords ended up in the swamp.
right.
Then you can fast forward now to them digging them back up.
Yeah,
And
no,
the
that's
tannic acids preserved the
yeah.
iron, the bronze, the ivory. So you got
Hmm.
ivory hilted swords.
Right.
So yes, I think you're right. I think probably in the 80s, maybe late 80s, early 90s,
Hmm.
they really started excavating it, and they put out a whole series of books on
Matt,
everything they found in the swamp.
there's so many different things in each of the books. It kind of focuses on
Hmm.
each of the various like jewelry or combs or
Yeah,
like
horse
whatever.
harnesses. Yeah,
Yeah, and I think it's books 11 and 12 that
11 and
focus
12. Yeah.
on the swords and the scabbards, I
The
think.
swords, hilts, and scabbards. Yeah, and
Yeah.
beautiful work and really beautifully done books. Really, they break down all the details,
Yeah.
except how to make the patterns.
That's well, the problem is they don't know how to make the patterns.
That's the
I
problem.
think
They don't, you know.
that's where makers like you and me come in, who have this experience with pattern welding, who can kind of have a concept or an
Hmm.
idea of how they could have been approached. And I was first introduced to them by Peter Johnson,
Hmm.
and and that was, God, I think it was just after I moved to Connecticut, so it must have been 2017. Yeah, 17. That he told me about these sword patterns, because I was introduced to Peter by Mike Quisenberry, who was taking a
Okay.
class at Zach Jonas's shop, and where Peter was teaching, and and Mike introduced me as this Damascus wizard or whatever he wanted to call me,
That's what you are. Yeah.
and so Peter was like, let me show you. And so he drew out these pictures, and then we pulled up, was it Helmut Fohl's page. He has let's say it's a hot link page, like he used to be what is it, professor of physical science or stuff like that in
Hmm.
Germany. Anyways, he's got this um massive website full of all this interesting history and stuff. Some of it's misleading I think he's not intentionally misleading. It's just he doesn't know um, exactly what he's talking about, especially when it
Right.
comes to the pattern welding stuff. But anyways, um, it's these diamond shapes and these palm shapes and these kind of pearlized, like pearl shapes. At least that's what they're referred to as in the books, the Ilaropadel books, 11 and 12. And the only reason I know that is because I was using Google Translate and taking pictures of the pages and translating the text so I could actually read what was going on. Um, but nobody's been able to properly replicate them, and
Hmm.
it's an interesting mystery. And I feel like I have a pretty good concept and of how they would have approached them and how they would have been made. But this trick still, when I first figured them out, or at least what I think is found the solutions for them, I don't know, like 5 years ago now, is that I didn't know the value of it. I was like, cool, but I don't make swords. I have no use for
Hmm.
these. And so, what's the value in these? And I realized that it's kind of the pinnacle of pattern welding and sword blade ornamentation of
Hmm.
the time, nearly 2,000 years ago, before I think maybe material technology changed and they realized they can get higher performance steels, um, or create higher performing steels from these different techniques or using different materials. And because these pattern welded swords were so labor intensive, that they shortcutted the blade, and then they spent more of their time ornamenting the hilts and the scabbards.
Hmm.
Um, and kind of moved away from the blade. And then it kind of came back again with the Vikings and their pattern welding, but then kind of got lost again,
Yeah, it may be. I
at
mean,
least
yeah,
in
I
Europe.
guess in Europe, although really, if you think about the pattern welding, if you consider the Illirup blades as maybe early European pattern welding, it never went away until the
Sure.
Ulfbert blades came around. All through the
Yeah.
migration era, they were pattern welding, not as complex
Right.
as what the Illirup pieces are, because by then they were going more to the linear and
Twisted bars, straight
herringbone,
bars.
right? The twisted
Yeah.
rods, which you do also see Illirup. That's the interesting thing on
Right.
the Illirup pieces. One side of it is almost always herringbone,
Yeah.
and the other side is these funky tile patterns.
Right.
And the my wife and I actually went to the Most Guard Museum and actually look, not touch them, but they've got tons of these things just scattered all over the museum. And the tile ones are actually quite brittle. They're literally snapped in two.
Sure.
I mean, very, very hard blades. Whereas some of the other ones that have what we call like the piled construction or the hairpin patterns, more just a linear, are like butter soft. They've got like cuts half an inch deep into the cutting edges.
Oh, wow.
So they're either really soft or really hard.
Yeah.
And so, on our way home from that trip, we were, sitting on the plane discussing the whole concept of how in the world they did the patterns. And that's where she was saying that it's like, it had to be something they did every day. They, if you look at all their swords and all the patterning they did on their swords, there were only certain processes they used constantly. Like, a Japanese sword, there's a specific process they use to make their swords. They can manipulate the grain a little bit this way or that, but the principles were always the same. And so we decided or deduced the concept that whatever this pattern they came up with was part of what they were doing on an everyday basis, and they just changed the approach to the rod, maybe.
The right.
The orientation of the grain. Right. They said, hey, instead of like just hammering it out into a twist rod, let's chop it up, flip it sideways, and then put it back together. That's where the challenge really comes in. Even if you could figure out the pattern, putting it all back together with a blade that may have, I don't know, 100 tiles. You have Did we send you a picture of my Illirup blade? It's not tile pattern, but it's a long spatha. I'm thinking Grace sent you a picture. It's got an ivory hilt.
We didn't.
Okay.
But I think I saw it over on your Facebook, if I can.
It's got like, I think, a red background. It's a long ivory hilted spatha.
Yeah.
But to do a blade of that length, and if it were tiled with little fences holding it all together, that's a monumental task to hold it together long enough to turn it into one solid bar.
Right. Here, I think I found the right one. You'll have to tell me if I got it right.
That's my shot. Jim Cooper did a shot of it, but that's the same. That's the same sword.
Okay.
Go to my Facebook and go to Berry. That's where you'll find the best.
To your Facebook or your website?
It's on my website. Yeah. Go to past work maybe.
Here, let me close that down real quick. And so, but can you talk? So I think you probably have a bit more history, and from what I understand, or what I think, from talking to people and what I've read, what my understanding is essentially these are Romanized Celts who have been doing pattern welding for hundreds of years, probably at that point. They already have a deep tradition of pattern welding, intentionally pattern welding, twisting bars, twisting, reverse twisting, multi-bars, all that kind of stuff. They've been doing that for a long time. And then all of a sudden, in the 1st to 2nd century, they start doing this other approach. And I had a friend who she does glasswork, and she's like, oh, it reminds me of Mille Fiori. And I'm like, what is that? And I guess, so what Mille Fiori is glass blowers will make what is essentially cane, or what they call cane, but it's a patterned rod, glass rod. And then they cut it up into tiny little beads, and then they lay it on a thing, and then they get a chunk of glass and they roll it across it, and it kind of bonds to each other as it goes in and out of the kiln, and it becomes part of the pattern on the surface of the vase or bowl or whatever. But it's a technique that I guess goes back to like 50 BC glassworking, and then it was lost in like basically kind of at the end of the Roman Empire for a while, before it was picked up again in like the 1200s or something like that, and then lost again before it's then picked up again a couple hundred, like maybe 100 years ago or so.
Right, you see the glass beads a lot, even in like Anglo-Saxon burials, things like that.
Right, and so in my head, I'm like, oh, interesting. I wonder if some very creative, out of the box thinking smith saw this Mille Fiori and was like, I think I can do that with steel. Because the value of the cane and chopping it up is that you just like mosaic patterns, you take that end cut and that becomes outward facing. And to see something like that happening in glass, I can, the only way I can imagine somebody approaching that is them seeing the glass work and be like, I think I can do that with steel, and then somehow figuring it out.
Yeah, because if you look at a twist rod, you're going to see the end grain. And if you see a pattern that you like in the end of the rod, the only way to get that onto your blade is to chop it up and flip it sideways and put it all back together.
Yeah.
It's the putting it back together that's the trick when it comes to a sword blade. Tell me, I know, I've tried. I actually have a successful sample that's 6 inches long of putting all the tiles back together and having them stay together in the forge. I have a longer version that didn't work so well.
Okay, the Vendel Swedish. Oh, that's not the right one.
No, it's
sorry.
That's okay. It'll say like Illerup or something.
Yeah.
Where was I? Oh, I know that you're referring to the concept of looking at one thing and translating it. All the garnet work that they did in Anglo-Saxon Vendel times was an attempt to replicate enameled cloisonne, but they didn't know how to do enamel, so they took garnets and cut them up instead, which to me is a whole lot harder to do than cloisonne.
Right. Wow. I didn't realize that.
Again, seeing one thing and trying to figure out mechanically, how can I replicate this without knowing the technique of what they did? So yeah, to see, like you say, what could be done in glass blowing and have a metal worker say, I can get a similar image in metal if I can figure out how to hold it all together.
Right.
I think that's why they were always backed up against the herringbone.
Right.
Because a herringbone is easy to make, and they did that all the time. That's like common knowledge for centuries prior to the Illerup.
Right. Yeah.
And there's actually a reference to the Romans bringing back sword blades from Germany. I don't remember where I read it, but whoever the historian was, it said that the blades that they brought back were curious in that they could see the reflection in the blade, but in the grain of the steel were these interesting patterns. So the swords were mirror polished.
Oh, wow.
So they weren't. I mean, my pattern welded blades, I can see myself in my pattern welded blades once I buff them up.
Right.
But the watering is there as well.
Yeah.
So these weren't like rough, crude,
Sure.
So why make such an intricate pattern if you didn't make it a part of the whole, deliberate beauty of the blade?
Right. Well, and that brings up an interesting point is like, did they keep it like that high polish, or did they sometimes work to bring out a contrast etch of some sort?
Well, but you could.
And how would they have done that?
Depending on the alloys, even if it were etched, like I say, my blades are etched, but they're mirror polished as well.
Right.
So you will see yourself trying to photograph a Damascus blade is great fun when it's polished, because it reflects the ceiling lights and the fan and everything else around.
Well, and I think that's why if you've ever sent work to Coop to have photographed, he actually hits it with Renaissance wax to dull the surface, I think, especially if it's too reflective.
That could be, yeah.
Because I've gotten pieces back and they have Renaissance wax on it. I'm like, what the hell? And I was like, oh, I wonder if it was too shiny.
Yeah,
which would make sense,
right? Yeah,
to slightly dull the surface. I did find your Spatha, I think. You'll have to correct me again if I got it wrong.
That's it. Yeah. That's it.
Okay, and so we'll pull it into. I'm gonna go big screen.
I thought I had a red background. I guess not. But that's the one with the great big centipede down the scabbard.
The great big centipede, is that what they call it?
That's what I call it. Having lived in Hawaii with centipedes that long.
Oh my god! Yeah. Monsters.
But that's very typical of the Illerup blades. So if you can imagine that whole blade in some kind of a funky mosaic pattern weld.
Yeah, that's amazing. And this one has, it looks like reversing. Oh, it looks like reverse twists across a straight line core.
Yeah, this is another of their patterns. There's no mosaic on this one. I was just I wanted to capture the whole look of the sword, and the fullers are different on the two sides. Does he have both sides there?
Oh, yeah.
One side's got 4, one side's got 3. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the other thing you'll see on these Illerup blades. There's a lot of them. The fullering's different on the two sides. And I think a lot of it had to do with the purpose of the pattern. The mosaic patterns typically aren't fullered.
Right.
Because if you fuller it, you're going to mess it up. You're messing up whatever it was they were trying to achieve.
Right. God, this piece is now, the longer I look at this, I'm looking at the details in the ivory at the guard and at the pommel. That's nuts. What kind of ivory was this that you were using?
That's all fossil walrus.
Fossil ivory.
It's the only stuff I can get that's in a big chunk that stays stable.
Right. That's because
And
And
that's
then
like some ridiculous amount of money just for the hilt on that thing. It's like 3 chunks of ivory, and you're looking for ivory that's the size of
yeah, I'm
like
gonna say that's probably at
a
least a couple
baseball or
$1,000
something.
right there, right? Um, well, and this is you were talking about your metal work earlier with the repoussé
Right, right.
and the sheet, and this is a perfect, I think, in the scabbard is a perfect
Yeah,
example.
especially like that center centipede piece is hollow, actually,
Yeah,
hollow backed.
right. Oh wow. And do you have forms that you're working with, like kind of dies, or are you just
Um,
freeforming that, or
a lot of my dad's work was done against lead blocks. So I
really?
learned I have like you would say like the male patterns for specific punches and things like that. And
Yeah,
then a lot of little anvils, things like that. But the soft work is done, or the I guess you would say the female side is usually just blocks of lead
I got you.
because it's forgiving. And he had made like little lead swage blocks with different size radiuses, and
Oh, interesting. And would
it's
he would
forgiving
carve the
against sheet
lead and
metals.
to create the shapes, or how would you create the shapes in there in
I
the
think he did a
lead?
rough casting
Oh, okay.
in
Oh,
sand first. He'd make like a block of wood and then
right.
just do a
Okay.
rough casting. But then I mean, the thing about lead is you can just take like a steel rod if you need a specific radius. Take a
Yeah.
steel rod and hammer it into the lead, and you'll suddenly have the radius you need.
Does lead work harden in
No,
any way, or it's
no,
just
doesn't
always
work
soft?
harden at all.
Wow.
It's a little bit too soft at times. Well, most of what I have is my dad's pure lead. I have some that's like tire lead, so it's got like a tin or a little bit of tin or something in it to make it a little bit
Hmm.
stiffer.
Okay.
It's a little more forgiving, but some of what I have is just pure lead, and it's soft like butter. But good and bad. If it mushrooms over, just hammer it back. It
Yeah.
never work hardens, but it's forgiving against even like silver and things like that.
Sure. Hmm. When it comes to doing these historical replicas, especially like I think I saw it was either in Blade or in Knife World magazine. You had an article that was about the experimental archaeology work that you were doing, probably around the Sutton Hoo sword.
Mm-hmm.
Like, one of my big things about these patterns and trying to recreate them, and as well as the way that they were originally made, is trying to figure out how to connect or coordinate with people, whether they're archaeologists or some, to get an article written around it. Just because, like I said, I have very little use for these patterns, though I think a lot of sword makers would love to know the techniques and be able to replicate them. My
Mm-hmm.
biggest thing is like, if I figure some of this stuff out, how do you go about getting credit, I guess, in a way, for rediscovering stuff? Or is there even any credit to be had? Because you've been in this game longer than I have, for sure, and done a lot more of this kind of replica work. Maybe I'm just chasing a fallacy in a
From
way.
a museum point of view, I don't know. I've done work, off and on, early on with the British Museum.
Right.
Barry Agger, who used to be the curator there, and Janet Lang, who did all the radiography work on Sutton Hoo and some later swords.
Hmm.
I had sent him a sample of the Windsor sword from the River Thames. I think it's got that kind of a repetitive
Oh, there's Zanshir,
backtrack. Yeah,
or is that what that's
they
called? Can't
Grace saw it on one of her mom's Chinese rugs, and she's like, "I know
Sure.
that pattern." And so they showed me a blade that had been pulled out of the Thames years ago. One of the times we were visiting early on when we were visiting the British Museum.
Yeah.
And so they pulled the sword out of storage and they showed me the blade and they're like, "Can you figure out how to do that?" And I said, "Oh, give me a chance." And so I came home and figured it out, sent them a test set piece of it.
Yeah.
And then I sent it as a paperweight for Barry Agger. And he said, "Can you send me an unwelded version of it?" And
Oh,
then
interesting.
they made a little display card, and it for quite a while was in their Germanic metalworkings gallery.
Oh,
I don't
cool.
know. I could ask Sue Brunning if it's still up or if it's on her desk now. I don't know.
Yeah.
But as far as getting notoriety in the museums, I don't know. I mean, I've done pieces. I've got a piece in the Museum of Ireland. I've got a couple of pieces at Culloden Visitors Centre, which are hands-on educational pieces. Museum of Ireland one was really the problem of there's a sword in Ireland in Dublin called the Monasterevan sword,
Is it this
and it's
one, or is
this
this a different
no, it's no that was actually done for a member of Wolf Hudness,
one? Okay.
and that's the Altoona sword. And same
Oh,
thing, he
okay.
asked me to do the Altoona sword, and I had seen the original on display, and so I had like a couple of pictures of it and a few measurements,
Hmm.
replicated it, and we went back several years later with the same group. And my customer who owned that sword had brought it with him, and so we were able to walk up to the case, put my
Oh,
sword right next to the original to see how close I actually was.
yeah,
Considering what I had to work with, I think I was pretty close.
yeah. Wow.
The Monasterevan sword was an odd, kind of a hybrid Scots-Irish medieval sword, kind of a huge two-handed looking thing, but really odd, funky sword.
Okay.
And I wanted to build it because it was so odd. So museum, they locked me in the basement in Dublin for a couple of hours with a
Oh, wow.
camera and stuff. And I drew picture. I had already drawn a picture, and I
Yeah.
took measurements and weighed the piece and photographed every angle I could think of. And then I made the sword because I wanted to know. That's it. I wanted to know what it looked like, but I didn't want to keep the sword, and I didn't want to
Sure.
sell it to anybody else. So I gave it to the museum
Okay.
because I figured it wasn't right for me to, have let them, they let me examine the sword, and then I made a profit off of it. So I just said, "You guys want it? You can have it."
Wow.
So that's
Well,
actually on display in Dublin,
that's cool.
right across from the original fragment.
And I think, I mean, the more I think about it, and the more I'm kind of like struggling with figuring out where to go with this stuff. I'm like, maybe I think more than anything, I think it would be cool to have work in a museum, and you have work in a museum, and I'm sure that probably feels maybe validating or pretty neat.
It it's validating, yeah, and that's the thing. It's like part of it is museums don't have money, so don't say, "Hey, look, I just created this. You want to buy it?"
You want to
They
buy
don't have
it?
that kind of money. It's like
Sure.
it's advertising. It's like, "Hey,
I
I
got
I
you.
got a sword. You guys, I really think." I mean, I intended for them to use it in their educational classes and stuff because
Sure.
I based it on an article that Andrew Halpin, who's one of their curators, had done. I think probably for his thesis or whatever. It was
Sure.
on Irish medieval swords, and so I
Oh,
used
wow.
his article extensively in the building of that.
Yeah.
And so I thought it would be great. They could have a sword. They could pass it around to school children or whatever.
Hmm.
It ended up on display. But in Culloden, they actually do pass around a basket hilt and a dirk
Right.
that we made. And that was the whole idea is like, if you're willing to donate to a museum something that's relevant to their collection, it
Sure.
does help your reputation. It gives you credibility if you say, I'm coming back next year. Do you have anything in storage we could look at? And Edinburgh is great about that. Our
Interesting.
last trip, they pulled out a dozen Scottish Dirks for us
Right.
because we contacted them ahead of time and said, "Hey, we're studying Scottish Dirks." We had met them numerous times before, and most museums are pretty accommodating if you explain who you are, what you're doing, give them some kind of credentials. I've been doing
Right.
this for years or whatever. Like with Anglo-Saxon, I'm co- connected with Wolf Hudness, which is the reenactment education group of Anglo-Saxon and Vendel era
Okay.
warriors, and they basically replicate graves. They do Sutton Hoo and some of the various things.
I was just gonna pull up one of your basket hilted Scottish basket hilt swords.
Yeah, I think that's from Blade Show last year,
Oh yeah. Is this
and that's
did this is this the one that won best sword last year?
yeah, I believe so. Yes,
Nice.
and that's
And
based on a
it's
John Allen basket and blade actually.
interesting. So John Allen so these are you've seen illustrations or photographs or
I've
something?
seen the original swords.
The originals. Okay.
Yeah, John Allen in Scotland. There was a Hammerman's Guild,
Okay.
again like the ABS.
Yeah.
And in order to become a hammerman, to actually be ranked, you had to submit, I think, 3 pieces.
Okay.
They weren't necessarily bladesmiths. Most swords you see in Britain, or especially in Scotland and Ireland, the blades most likely came out of Germany. They weren't really
Okay.
bladesmiths, they were hilters or sword slippers, they called them. So they would bring in bundles of blades, usually in groups of
Oh wow.
hundreds,
Okay.
and then they would make hilts for them. That's why Scottish baskets are unique to Scotland. The blades are all over the place design wise. You see sabers, you see single edge, you see double
Sure.
edge, and a lot of them have German hallmarks, and they didn't hide that fact because they were, um, Andrea Ferrara or the fake Andrea Ferrara blades were highly prized in Scotland,
Yeah.
as were Peter Wundis, and there were a number of others. But the schools, or the Hammerman's Guild, I guess, was a ranked system where you couldn't mark your pieces if you weren't a guild member. So
Oh,
John Allen apprenticed under John Simpson out of Glasgow. John Allen was out of Stirling. He had a son, John Jr., and a son, Walter.
okay.
And Walter Allen became like very well known. He got a little more Art Nouveau in his styles of Scottish baskets.
Oh,
This
wow.
is all mid 1700s.
Sure.
And then James Grant was Walter's apprentice. And then the Hammermen's Guilds, I don't think they ever actually shut down or closed, just times changed.
Sure.
And they moved on, got away from the guilds. But to mark your blades, you had to be an actual guild member.
I got you.
And so I studied John Allen and Walter Allen's work quite a bit.
Wow. Yeah, it's pretty stunning. And in those baskets, I'm seeing like piercing work, I'm seeing file work, I'm seeing
Inlay work.
Yeah, inlay. It's pretty nuts. And are you are you silver soldering all these pieces, or does it start as one solid piece that it's formed into the shape of the basket? Like, that's something I can't wrap my head around.
No, the baskets are actually, I use modern welding techniques.
Okay.
The originals were actually forge welded together.
Wow. Okay.
I'm not exactly sure how they forge welded them together. I got concepts.
Yeah.
I know that the pieces were pinned before they were welded.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I know that for a fact, that you can see. I've studied one of John Allen's that's an unmounted basket.
Mm-hmm.
And you can actually, on the inside of the basket, see the remnants of the pins that were used to hold the components together prior to forge welding.
God, what a nutty thing to try to forge
and
weld
so
together.
they're actually assembled. Even the originals were assembled from multiple components.
I got you. Well, and then you complement the piece. And is the engraving work, the carving work that you do on the handle, is that also traditional, or is that your thing? Or
it's our thing, but I have seen a John Allen basket with a carved grip, at least one. A lot of times they were like stingray or sharkskin grips, or just plain leather, but some of them were actually carved. And so because we can, Grace is a good carver of knotwork, so it just complements the work. It makes it special.
I got you. I didn't realize Grace was doing the carving work. That's
Grace
awesome.
Grace does all my carving. All my carving work.
See, that's amazing, because the carving, oh gosh, it's hard to see it on this one.
We even have a book.
You have a book?
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about the book.
It's probably on my website. It's called How to Carve Scottish Dirks. It's just a book about basically how to build a Scottish dirk.
Okay.
Interesting. It walks you through the layout of the knotwork, the shaping of the grip. Actually, it walks you through the making of the leather over wood scabbard and the sheet metal fitting. So it's kind of a complete how-to. Even if you're not doing a Scottish dirk, it's a how-to on. That's it.
Yeah.
On how to do wooden scabbards and sheet metal fittings as well.
Right. Oh, wow.
Whether or not you're carving a Scottish dirk.
Sure.
It shows you how to do ferrules and pommel caps.
That sounds like a great resource. This is a physical book?
It's a physical book. It's a booklet. I wouldn't call it a book. It's not like a 300-page book. It's on my table at Blade Show.
Okay. I might have to ask for something like that.
We're slowly working on one on how to build Scottish basket hilts, but she's been having issues with her Microsoft Word, which is how we format the books before we go to print. So
I got you. Crazy.
But we're working on it.
I'm trying to think. I know you. So right now, getting ready for Blade Show, we're taking time away from you. We're already at 2 hours.
You're right. The time does go fast. This is what I'm working on. So this is what I've got to finish for Blade Show.
Oh yeah. Here, let me. I'm gonna make you bigger real quick.
Make me bigger. Okay.
Let's see. Let's swap these. Boom.
Okay. There we go. So this is the Schiavona, and you can see details.
What culture history, like, where does that come from? Is that
Italian? This is Venetian Italian, comparable, I believe, more or less to the era of the Cinquedeas.
Okay.
It's called a Schiavona.
Yeah.
It's a Venetian basket hilt.
Okay. Very cool.
So
yeah,
it'll be there.
I can't wait to see that. And
it'll be there. It may not be done, but I'll have the engraving. I'm actually moving along quite nicely on the engraving.
Oh, nice. I'm glad to hear that.
The scabbard may or may not be finished, but scabbard's only, even with the engraving, maybe 2 days. So if I can get the engraving done this week, I'll be okay, because I leave in 2 weeks.
Right. Do you have multiple pieces that you're bringing?
I'll have 2 Viking swords on the table, a long Viking sea axe, 2 Viking swords, 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 2 Damascus and sterling Scottish Dirk, and Irish Skein, which is kind of an Irish version of a Scottish Dirk. It's an odd knife that there's only a few left in existence that are
Oh, wow.
semi-complete.
I think I
So
saw on your
it's,
Facebook page that you the
yeah,
skein photo.
I just finished it. There was a book that a guy came out with last year, and so I made the first one for him
Okay,
because because he did the book and he gave me a copy of it. So I thought I'd make
right,
one for him. And so yeah, it's an odd. It's when you see it, you can kind of see how it evolved from a Viking CX,
sure. Yeah,
which would
the
make
hilting
sense.
looks very similar, but the blade form is different.
The blade is funky and very typical. That blade is almost a half-inch thick on the spine.
Holy
It's
smokes!
ridiculous knife,
Yeah,
but the Irish, the Vikings were in Ireland for so long. I can
yeah.
see easily how it developed because the sheath that they carry, that sheath is replicated from originals, and
Okay,
you can see easily how the CX sheath was the predecessor to that sheath.
sure. Yeah.
They found thousands of CX sheaths in Dublin.
Oh wow. I'm going to be going to Ireland right after Blade Show. I get back from Blade Show and I turn around and fly out to Ireland.
Oh wow, where are
Do
you
you have
going?
any? I'm going to be in Cork County in West Cork, but in the last couple days, I'll be driving up the west coast of Ireland across to Dublin, and then we fly out of Dublin to Italy,
Okay,
just south
if
of
you
Florence.
get a chance, you got to go to the National Museum of Dublin.
National Museum of Dublin. Okay.
It's right downtown, right across from the college.
Okay.
Worth going to. Then you can go visit my monastery of Sword while you're there. Say hi to it.
Oh, all right.
Other than that, National Museum, Collins Barracks, if you got time, I don't know how much time you'll have in Dublin, but National Museum is definitely worth a visit. There's lots of
Okay.
Irish gold,
Oh,
some
interesting.
bog bodies.
Oh, right. W-
They got everything. They got Egyptian stuff.
what's the deal with Irish gold? I've been seeing articles about Irish
It's got a
gold lately.
specific color. It's a little bit redder color. It's a
Redder.
very pure, but it's got a deep, almost. I mean, it doesn't look like red gold, but it has a richer color to it.
Interesting. Okay.
And they've got one whole room dedicated to all the stuff that was found in the bogs.
Okay.
Like when they're harvesting peat, they would come out with all these like gold torques and
Oh, wow.
things like that.
And was that gold that was there in Ireland, or was it
It's
brought
it's
there from the
natural. As far as I
Vikings?
know, it's natural to Ireland.
Oh,
So
wow.
when they reference Irish gold, they're referring to gold, as far as I know, from Ireland itself.
I got you. Interesting. I didn't know that that was a thing. And then I saw, and I actually just saw the article again today, but there was this article that I saw on Facebook about Irish gold that was hidden in a false axe head. So the axe head had a cavity, and there was Irish gold hidden inside of it.
Hmm.
But I guess it was like a false head, because when people, like, if they were stopped, they wouldn't think twice about the axe head. And the
Could
fact
be
that it was full of gold, it was interesting to see that. But I was
interesting.
like, Irish gold, what's the deal with Irish gold? I don't know anything about that. But
Yeah,
okay. Well, I want to let you still have a solid work day and let you get back to it. I
I
really
started
appreciate.
engraving at 7,
Okay.
so I
Yeah.
got an hour in.
Nice. Um, and I can't wait to see your work at Blade Show. What other shows do you do?
I did Solvang this year. I just signed up as a guest for AKI this
Okay,
year, so
that's
we'll
exciting.
see what happens there. But
And that's in Las Vegas, is that correct?
yeah, Las Vegas. I think it's the last Saturday of October, I
Of
believe.
October. Okay.
Yeah, that's just a. They keep asking me to do it, so I thought, okay, I'll do it once. My main problem is trying to get work done
Sure.
for the show, plus getting show work done for next year for Solvang and this, Blade show.
Right.
Plus, I've still got commission work I try to fill in too. And everybody
Oh,
wants
interesting.
something complex, so
Yeah.
which is good because I don't do basic stuff. I get bored by swords that have like three
Sure.
parts to them.
Yeah. Um, Gosh, what was I gonna say? Oh, I'm gonna ask you kind of like the forbidden question I've heard is the no question to ask people at knife shows. How long does it take you to build a sword? I
That's
imagine
the
it.
one it's easy for me to say. I don't know.
Yeah, sure.
I work 5 projects at a time. So I mean, if
Right.
I were to sit down and say, okay, I'm going to work on, oh, let's say a basket hill, let's say inlaid basket hill,
Okay.
3 months,
Sure. Just the
you
basket
know,
hilt.
just for the basket hill, like this Schiavona, I
Yeah.
basically set. I've got what, 2 weeks to finish the engraving.
Okay.
Pommel was already engraved. The grip was already done. So when I came back from Solvang, I pretty much focused on getting. Actually, I hadn't even polished the blade out yet. So, but anyway, I started a week ago Monday. Yeah,
Wow.
and I figured I gave myself 2 weeks to get the engraving done.
Incredible.
So and that's not an inlaid basket. On
Right.
an inlaid basket, you're probably talking a month just in the work on
Yeah.
embellishing the basket of a Scottish basket hilt. So
Wow.
you could easily say 3 months on a basket hilt.
Yeah.
So hence why I've got like so many projects that are like 2-year projects because they're complex.
Right. And you care about doing it right.
If it's not done right, it's not worth doing. I'm not going to
Sure.
rush a job to just cut a corner and get it done. I'll
Yeah.
just tell the guy it'll be done when it's done, and it'll be right when it's done, or it won't get done.
Yeah, no, and that's actually that brings me. I know I said I was going to let you go, but I keep coming up with questions. When you interact with customers, how does that work, especially for work that is going to take time? Do you try to project any timeline, or you just say
Um,
um, it might be a couple years,
it,
but it might be longer?
yeah, I tell people, you're looking at 5 years, but that's not 5 years from the time I started. So that's really hard.
Yeah.
In the last Knives Annual or a few back, there was an article I did called, what was it called? Of ravens and cow guts, something to that effect.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It's about the building of the Vallarta 7.
Okay.
And I was basically given a 1.5 year time frame. It had to do with he owned a version of that sword. He wanted a new, more accurate version.
Hmm.
So he said, can you get it done in 18 months? And I said, sure. So that one, again, there was a lot in that project because there were so many details we had to get right for it to look like the original.
Right.
And so I started it. I was constantly back and forth over Messenger with him, confirming pictures and ideas. And,
Yeah.
and basically I got it done in time. I think I was actually early in my delivery,
Oh,
but
nice.
there was a lot of time dedicated just to that project.
Sure. Well, I guess another question to follow that up with is, um, how do you manage the money aspect? Because, like you're saying, these builds are so intensive, and there's so many details, and they take a lot of time. Um, do you take any money up front, or when you start the build, or because once you get through it, what do you like? What would happen if someone were to back out? Like, do you feel confident that you'd still be able to just turn around and sell it if somebody else
Yeah,
backed out?
I
You're not even worried about any money.
I don't take any money in advance only
Sure.
because I saw what happened with my parents or my dad specifically being a
Oh,
full-time artist. You take the money 6 months before you start the project. You go to start the project and you spent the money on previous stuff. You don't have the money for the materials.
yeah,
It's just like, no, I take no money up front.
yeah,
Um, I just basically, the work that I do is unique. So I figured if they back out, someone else will want it.
right.
The only time I've taken not so much money up front as if guy wanted like a specific piece of ivory for a project, I'd say,
Oh,
okay,
interesting.
either I'll buy the ivory and you pay for it, or you pick the ivory, give me the piece of ivory.
Right.
And that's basically it. But I don't take money up front because I don't want to be burdened by having their money. And let's say something happened to me. Then Grace
Sure.
is stuck trying to pay somebody back for something that never got finished.
Yeah, that's fair. That's a good
So
point.
it's like, nope, no money up front. When it's done, I'll say, here, it's done. This is how much it is. If you want it, send me the money. Or
Yeah.
a lot of my customers are repeat customers. So it's like, I'm not worried. I
Oh,
just
that's
send them
good.
the project. I say, if you like it, pay me.
Yeah. Interesting.
Because they're guys, most of them are people I've dealt with for years. And it's,
I see.
over and over the same guy ordering something different
Right.
or just seeing something I did and saying, hey, I like that one. Is it for sale?
Right.
So I
Hmm.
don't worry about that.
That's great. That's a great position. That's a great spot to be in. I'm gonna also put you on record on saying that I want to come down and work with you. I think it'd be fun for us
Sure.
to. Well, and I know you're busy, You're super busy. I got also my own stuff going on,
You're
but
busier than I am, probably.
I don't know. This year I'm pretty busy, but I think I would love to get together with you, especially around those Illirup swords, to do a proper recreation.
Hmm.
I mean, I can help with the blade side of things, but that's about as far as my skills and
Your
techniques go.
insight into pattern manipulation is what I see as valuable. I can build the sword once we figure out how to get the pattern and how to make it all stick together.
Sure.
I have ideas on how to make it stick together, but the idea is first thing you got to do is capture the pattern correctly.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
like I say, if I get a chance, I'll play with a little bit of that this summer because I think I have an idea.
Yeah. Absolutely. No, I think it would be super fun. And I think
But yeah, you're welcome to come by
I've
my shop.
excellent. I appreciate it.
I'm 4 hours north of Travis, I'd say.
Right.
Yeah,
And also
three
for
to
people who
four.
are listening and watching, Travis Wert's Hammering is a great spot
Hmm.
for people to see you and see you work. This year you demonstrated, was it welding up, doing an edge weld around was it
Yeah,
multi-bar core?
it was a 2 bar twist, a
2 bar.
herringbone twist.
Right.
And I will be doing similar at the Great Midwestern Hammering in
Oh, are you?
Ohio.
Oh, in Ohio, right?
It's the one in Troy, Ohio at the end of
Okay.
August. I think
Okay.
I'm supposed to be there.
Are you a member of the
I saw my
ABS?
name on the flyer. Member of ABS? I've been a member of ABS for years.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, I'm a master apprentice.
Master Apprentice. I love it.
They can never figure me out. Whenever B.R. Hughes would write an article and he got to me, he would say, member,
Right. Member.
member, that works.
I
Covers
got
all
you.
bases. I'm a member. I've been a member for a long time. I
Right.
support the organization. I like what they do. I don't like politics in general, but
Sure.
I like the principles of what they're doing.
Right. Yeah, because that Troy that hammering that in Troy, Ohio is the ABS
I
hammering,
think it's
right?
ABS sponsored or
Okay.
sanctioned or something. It was
Yeah.
separate for years, but last year they did like a joint where they were doing testing for journeyman and
Oh, right.
master
Yeah, yeah,
smith,
yeah.
I think. But they
Yeah.
said they're not doing that every year. But I did notice that it was up on the ABS website as well.
Okay.
And
Well,
that's
that's cool.
supposed to be a really fun hammer. I think Kevin Cashin's going to be there.
That'll be cool.
So it
Are
should be a
there
good gathering.
what are some makers that whose work I don't know how much time you spend on social media or something, but makers work that either from the past or modern makers who you're seeing do some really interesting work that
Mm,
um, either people might not know about or just like in general are inspiring to you or
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Well, I mean, obviously Kevin Cashin, he's been kind of doing this stuff for quite a while too.
right.
Um, of the recent guys, Jordan Lamoth's been getting into some really
Oh yeah,
interesting Indo-Persian stuff.
right. The Kafgari
Don,
work is awesome.
yeah, his Kofgadi is really nice.
Yeah,
Don Fogg, obviously, early
right.
inspiration. Don Fogg and Bill Moran's Viking daggers and all that stuff from way
Sure.
back when is a lot of what inspired me to go in that direction as well.
Hmm.
I mean, a lot of the older ABS Smiths, I like their work, Harvey Dean, Tim
Right.
Hancock's work, just for what it was.
Sure.
Bowie knives or not, the work is clean, inspirational. Jim Thornberger, I love his price daggers.
Okay. Yeah.
And a lot of these are old timers. A lot of them were my friends
Sure.
because I grew up in the early ABS days of, not early.
Yeah.
Wayne Valkovic, who nobody's ever heard of probably, was the inspiration for the folders that I used to do.
Okay. What kind of folders were they?
Tail locks.
Tail locks. Oh, is that a Spanish or Italian thing?
I don't know. It's got a little stub sticking out the back end of the grip that you push down on.
Yeah.
If you type in Wayne Valkovic, you'll come up with pictures of it because you probably
Okay.
won't find too many pictures of mine. But
Okay.
Wayne moved to Hawaii to retire and he had
Oh,
finished up
interesting.
some projects. And so he came to my shop to forge one last billet. And so he showed me how he made his folders. And
I got you.
I kind of ran with that for a little while.
Yeah.
I might still do one occasionally. I just don't have the time right now. But he
Just
was a master smith. He retired. He's fishing in Florida now, I think.
oh, good for him.
His wife's on Facebook. So.
I got you. Nice. Um, You were sorry, I just keep thinking about Hawaii since the beginning of the conversation. You mentioned that your father was an engineer doing dredging work. I feel like I remember learning about the history of Oahu, where a lot of what is like Waikiki used to be kind of swamplands, and they dredged. And so
Yeah,
was he doing that work to like make
he when
backfill and
he
make the water?
moved when he moved to Hawaii, Ala Moana Shopping Center was just being built. And
Okay.
yes, that was all swamp land. They were dredging up. Hawaiian Dredging was a company and part of Dillingham Corporation. And they built the shopping center. Hawaiian Dredging did the dredging up of the sand and the pile driving. And I just remember my dad saying he saw a promotional video for them when they were building the shopping center and they were pile driving.
Hmm.
And the piles were punching through the coral shelf. And the
Okay.
pile driver was chasing the piles.
Oh.
There were another 8 punch to the shelf and they were sinking faster than the pile driver could drive them. And my dad's
Oh,
like,
geez.
you can't show that to people.
Yikes.
And I actually knew a guy on the Big Island that was one of the welders at
Okay.
that time. And he said, oh, yeah, they just kept stacking piles on them
Just
until they
kept.
stopped.
Oh my God.
And
Okay.
then when my dad went to work around that time, would have been early 60s. Actually, very early because I was almost born in Egypt. He was sent to the Suez Canal. Hawaiian Dredging was contracted to dredge out part of the Suez Canal.
Oh wow.
So he and his barge and his crew of Hawaiian guys went down there
Right.
and dredged part of the Suez Canal. And if the project had gone longer, they were going to move the family down there, and I would have been born in Egypt.
Wow.
Good or bad, the
Yeah.
project was done, and I wasn't born there.
Yeah. And then towards your end of the time in Hawaii, you were on the Big Island or still on Oahu?
After 2 years after we got married, we moved to the Big Island in 1990,
Okay.
and then we left there at the end of 97.
What part of the island were you on?
Outside of Hilo, on the east
Okay.
side, technically in Puna.
Okay.
Then we moved up here to Arizona. After the rodeo fire, we moved to Washington State for 4.5 miserable years.
Oh, you didn't like Washington?
It was a bit damp and dreary for us. I love the
Yeah.
wildlife, just didn't like the weather. We
Yeah.
were in Kathlamet,
Oh, okay. Yeah.
and so down near the coast, along the Columbia River. Then we moved back to the Big Island for another 7 years, and now we're back here.
Yeah. Okay.
It's nice up here. It's convenient being on the continent because I can drive to the shows, and knife
Right.
and gun finishing supplies is 20 minutes away. So
Oh, just down the road.
I can buy grinder belts. I can go buy stabilized wood.
Yeah.
Pretty much get whatever I need in town.
Oh, you must be close to Laramie Jackson because he told me that Knife and Gun is
Yeah,
about 20
he's
minutes
on
from
the other
him
side
too.
of he's on the other side of town. He's in Clay Springs.
Yeah.
So he's same distance in the opposite direction of Shoal than I am.
Yeah.
But we got
I
Tanner
got
McFalls up here. Ken McFall, of course. And then Randy Lee's not too far from me.
Okay.
There's quite a few makers up here actually in this area.
Sure. Are you going to be at Travis Wertz's Hammering again next year? Are you planning on that yet?
I'm sure I will. Yeah,
Yeah.
one way or another, I'll be there.
Okay.
I told him I don't mind demoing. It's fun.
Yeah. Cool.
I might do some interrupted twisting to show how you would lay out for like a Sutton Hoo type blade.
Oh yeah, sure.
To do sectional interrupted twists.
Right. Very cool. Well, I hope to catch you there because my plan is to go and be there again and demonstrate again. I really enjoyed it this year.
It's fun. The Hammering's a lot of fun.
Hammering is a lot of fun. It's very busy. I forgot how many people there were to talk to. There's just a lot of people there. There's like you and Owen and other makers that I really wanted to sit down and chat with. I didn't even get. I think I said hi to Kelly from Novella like twice, and I didn't even actually get a chance to talk to her at all.
She was in Solvang. So.
Oh, nice, excellent. Yeah, so. Well, I hope to catch you again there. If people are interested in seeing more of your work, you're not on Instagram, right?
I don't do Instagram. I'm on Facebook. I've got my website. I'll be at Blade Show.
Your website's pretty nice. And is your Facebook's public facing or is it?
Yeah, public. It's Vince Evans.
Okay.
Just make sure you get me and not the football player.
Not the football player. Okay. And then otherwise, can people find out about events that you have coming up through your website or a newsletter? Or How do people know when to see you and where to see
I
you?
don't know.
Okay.
I probably should have something on my website maybe, but about where I'm going to be. But in general, aside from the hammer-ins, typically it's Blade Show.
Sure.
I added Solvang because I wanted to, and I'm obviously going back next year. It's a lot of fun. I didn't even want to leave town Sunday morning because we stopped at the bakery, and it's like, God, do we have to leave? Such a neat little town.
Yeah, I'll be curious to maybe try to check that out next year. I heard from
it's
Will
worth
Brigham too.
coming to. You know, it's a fun show, and like I say, the town itself is fun. The restaurants are great. It's a really small town. You can walk it. I mean, we were staying half a block from the show.
Yeah.
And the hotel is not that big, so it's really small. You can just stay parked at the hotel, walk and eat dinner afterwards.
Nice.
You know, good restaurants, good coffee shops and bakeries. They're known for their pastries, and just a neat theme, nice Danish theme there.
Yeah. Very cool.
Everybody should come to Solvang.
Absolutely. All right, and with that, we'll let me just give a quick shout out one more time to all of our super sponsors. We have Lawrence Lake of Maritime Knife Supply on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok as @Maritime Knife Supply, as well as online, maritimeknifesupply.com. Gabe Fletcher of Anchorage Forge, which is his maker page, as well as Anchorage Brewing, the brewing page. Eric Kidwell of District 202 LLC. Josh Weston, who is on Instagram as @Josh A. Weston, as well as part of the Dragon Forge EXP. That's the Dragon Forge experience. Russell Tinsley of Oozle Finch Beers. His maker page is Can't Make Knives, and his brewing pages are Oozle Finch Beers. Oozle spelled OOZLE, Finch Beers, and then as well as @Nost NOST Brewing Project. And then finally, we have Dan Hubbs of 66 Mountain Knives on Instagram, Facebook the numbers 66 Mountain Knives. Thank you, Vince. I really appreciate all your time. I know you got a lot going on just before Blade Show.
It was fun, but
you gave us 2.5 hours. It's a massive gift, and I hope people got some great value out of it. Your work is phenomenal and absolutely worth following. And finding, you have beautiful photos. Your website's one of the most comprehensive of past work, and you have a lot of nice professional photos of your work.
Thank Grace for that, and various photographers.
Yeah, thank you, Grace, and thank you, Grace, for all your awesome engraving and carving work that you do on the hilts. Love it, and I can't wait to see you at Blade. I can't wait to see that piece.
See you next month. It'll be fun.
Yeah,
I'm on the front row this year.
Oh yeah, people can find you at the front row.
Yeah, 1R this year, right between Kevin Cashin and Kyle Royer.
Nice. Well, you guys will have some good conversations. I'm sure. Excellent. All right. Take care, everybody. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you later.